The fire in the hearth had gone cold. In the stone chamber beneath Lancaster Castle, the woman called old Demdike sat with her hands bound in iron, her breath coming shallow in the damp air. Outside, through the narrow slit of window, the moors of Lancashire stretched dark beneath a sky heavy with August rain. The year was 1612, and in the cells around her, 9 others waited, daughters, granddaughters, neighbours, all condemned by words spoken in fear, by accusations whispered across hedgerows and in market squares. The witch trials had begun not with fire or fury, but with a simple encounter on a country road, a refusal to give, and a child who fell ill the next morning. Now, in this fortress of stone and judgment, the accused waited for the assizes, for men in black robes to decide which of them would hang. In the villages below Pendle Hill, families who had known each other for generations no longer spoke. Mothers kept their children indoors. The forest that climbed the hill's western slope seemed darker now, as if something ancient had awakened in its shadows. And in the castle, the old woman closed her eyes and remembered when the world was different, when her grandmother had taught her the old ways beneath the same hill, beneath the same indifferent sky. Chapter 1. The Hill and its Shadows. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small around you. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour the clock shows in your corner of the world, know that you are safe here in this moment. Before we begin our journey backward through time, if you find comfort in these stories whispered from history's darker corridors, do consider subscribing to this channel. And now, let us drift backward, past centuries of smoke and progress, past the noise of the modern world, into the England of King James, into the shadow of a hill that has never forgotten what transpired upon its slopes. The hill rose from the Lancashire moors like a sleeping giant, its summit often lost in mists from what rolled down from the Pennines. The people who lived in its shadow called it Pendle Hill, though the name itself was redundant. Pendle meant hill in the old tongue, the language spoken before the Normans came, before even the Saxons claimed this northern country. It was a place of ancient memory, where Roman roads had once carried legions toward Hadrian's Wall, where Celtic tribes had marked the turning of seasons with fire and sacrifice. By the year 1612, in the 10th year of King James's reign over England, the hill remained what it had always been, a boundary between the known world and something older, a place where the forest grew thick and the wind carried voices that might have been nothing more than weather. The villages that clustered at the hill's base were small and poor. Newchurch stood on the southern slope and its church tower visible for miles across the moors. Barley lay to the west, where the forest began. Readhall, home to the magistrate Roger Nowell, commanded the southern approach with the authority of stone and wealth. These were not the prosperous market towns of the south, not the thriving ports where merchants grew fat on wool and wine. This was the north of England, where the Reformation had come late and with reluctance, where many families still whispered prayers to the Virgin in the old Latin their grandparents had taught them, where the authority of the distant king in London felt as remote as the authority of God himself. The people scratched their living from thin soil and bitter weather. They kept sheep on the commons, grew oats in narrow fields carved from the moorland, and when the harvest failed, as it often did, they went hungry. The great families held the land, and the poor survived on their edges, occupying cottages that were little more than stone walls and thatch, burning peat for warmth, eating porridge and turnips and whatever game they could trap in the forest. It was a hard country that produced hard people, where children died young and women aged quickly, where winter meant darkness at 3 PM and cold that seeped through walls and into bones. The old religion had not died easily here. When King Henry had broken with Rome 3 generations past, when his daughter Elizabeth had solidified the Protestant settlement, the North had resisted. The rising of the North in 1569 had seen Catholic lords attempt to restore the old faith, and though the rebellion failed, though the leaders were executed and their lands confiscated, the sympathies remained. In Lancashire, recusant families, those who refused to attend the Anglican Church, who paid fines rather than abandon Rome, were common enough that the authorities could not prosecute them all. Priests moved in secret through the countryside, saying Mass in hidden rooms, hearing confessions, administering the sacraments that Protestant law had made legal. The people learned to keep two faces, one for the magistrate, one for their own souls. Into this landscape of suspicion and survival, King James brought his particular obsessions. He had written a book on the subject of witchcraft, the Demonology, published in 1507, while he was still only King of Scotland. In it, he argued that witches were real, that they made compacts with Satan, that they could curse and kill through maleficium, harmful magic. When he came south to claim Elizabeth's throne in 1603, he brought these beliefs with him, and Parliament responded by passing a new Witchcraft Act in 1604, making it a capital offence to invoke evil spirits or to use witchcraft to kill. The penalty was death by hanging. The common people had their own beliefs about magic, older and more practical than the demonology of kings and scholars. They believed in cunning folk, wise women and men who could cure illness with herbs, who could find lost objects, who sold charms against misfortune. They believed that some people possessed the evil eye, that a curse spoken in anger could sour milk or kill livestock. They believed that the world was full of invisible forces, that the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, that spirits walked abroad on uncertain nights. These were not the sophisticated theories of learned men, but the folk magic that had existed in England since before Christianity, adapted and absorbed into the framework of Christian belief, neither wholly pagan or wholly orthodox, but something particular to the villagers and the poor. On Pendle Hill, two families had acquired reputations for possessing such powers. They were known to their neighbours, feared by some, sought out by others, tolerated because they occupied the margins of society where authority rarely looked. They were beggars, mostly, moving from farm to farm asking for oatmeal or milk. And the farmers usually gave because it was easier to give than to risk offending them, to risk a curse. They lived in hovels in the forest, in places with names that reflected their poverty and isolation. Malkin Tower, a crumbling structure that was barely a house at all. They were families without men mostly, or with men too old or too broken to work. They survived on the edge of starvation, on charity and fear, on the uncertain trade of healing and fortune-telling. The Demdike family took their name from the matriarch Elizabeth Southerns, called Old Demdike by everyone who knew her. She was ancient by the standards of the time, perhaps 80 years old in 1612, blind and unable to walk without assistance. Her daughter Elizabeth Device lived with her at Malkin Tower, along with Elizabeth's 3 children, Alison, James and Janet, the youngest, who was perhaps 9 years old. They were known throughout the district. Old Demdike had a reputation as a cunning woman, someone who could cure the bewitched, who knew charms and prayers that worked when the physician's remedies failed. The Chattox family lived nearby, equally poor, equally feared. Anne Whittle, called Old Chattox, was nearly as old as Demdike, and the two families had been rivals for years, competing for the same uncertain living, blaming each other when misfortune struck their few clients. Chattox had a daughter, Anne Redfern, who lived with her husband in the village. Between these two families existed a tension that everyone recognised, a hostility born of competition and proximity, of accusations traded back and forth across the forest paths. Roger Nowell watched over this landscape from Red Hall. He was a gentleman, a magistrate, responsible for keeping the king's peace in this portion of Lancashire. He was educated, literate, connected to the larger world of English law and government. He knew of the king's interest in witchcraft. He knew that prosecuting witches could demonstrate loyalty, could show that even here, in this remote corner of the realm, the king's justice operated. He had heard the rumours about the families on Pendle Hill, the whispered stories of curses and maleficium, but rumours alone were not sufficient for the law. He needed accusations, confessions, evidence that could stand before judges at the assizes. The winter of 1611 had been cruel, and the spring of 1612 brought little relief. The harvest of the previous year had been poor, and hunger sharpened tempers, made people see malice in misfortune. In such times explanations were sought, and when a child sickened or cattle died, when bread failed to rise or butter would not come, the question was not if someone had caused it, but who. The people of Pendle lived in a world where cause and effect were mediated by invisible forces, where the natural and the supernatural interpenetrated, where God and the devil contested for human souls and used human agents to wage their war. The forest on the western slope remained dark even at midday, the canopy so thick that little light reached the ground. Paths wound between ancient oaks and twisted thorns, passing the ruins of older habitations, stone foundations where families had lived and died and been forgotten. The Demdikes and Chattoxes knew these paths, moved through the forest with the confidence of long familiarity. To the farmers and villagers, the forest was a place to avoid after dark, a place where things moved that were not quite animal, where voices called from no visible source. The hill itself seemed to possess a quality of attention, as if it observed the small dramas of human life with the patience of stone and earth. In the villages, people attended church on Sunday as the law required, listened to sermons in English instead of Latin, sang hymns from the approved psalter. But in their homes, they kept objects that the reformers would have condemned, rosary beads hidden in thatch, images of saints concealed behind panelling, prayers written in the old language and worn as charms against evil. The division between Protestant orthodoxy and Catholic tradition was not clean, and beneath both lay something older still, the folk beliefs that no Act of Parliament could erase. The people prayed to God and also threw salt over their shoulders. They took communion and also buried iron beneath doorsteps to keep out malevolent spirits. They lived in a world thick with meaning, where everything signified, where nothing happened by pure chance. The road from Colne to Halifax ran along the southern edge of Pendle Hill, a track of mud and stone that merchants and pedlars used, carrying their wares between market towns. It was a journey of several hours on foot, longer in winter when the moors flooded and the fords became impassable. The road passed through territory that belonged to no one and everyone, common land where the poor had traditional rights to graze animals and gather firewood. It was on this road on a day in March 1612 that the ordinary and the terrible would intersect, that a simple transaction would fail to occur, and that failure would set in motion events that would end with 10 bodies hanging from gallows on the moors above Lancaster. The hill watched, the forest kept its shadows, and in the cottages scattered across the slopes, women who had survived by their wits and their reputations began to sense that something had changed, that the fragile tolerance that had allowed them to exist was fraying. But they were old and tired and had nowhere else to go, and so they remained, waiting without knowing they were waiting, as history gathered itself for what would come next. Chapter 2. The Families of the Forest. Old Demdike had been born Elizabeth Southerns, though few remembered her by that name anymore. The nickname had stuck to her, the way mud stuck to wool, impossible to wash away, becoming part of her identity. She had lived through the reigns of 4 monarchs, the boy King Edward, the brief and bloody return of Catholicism under Mary, the long Protestant rule of Elizabeth, and now James, who claimed descent from both the English and Scottish crowns. She had been young when the monasteries were dissolved, when the great abbey at Whalley was destroyed and its stones carried away by local farmers to build walls and barns. She had seen the world change, had adapted to survive those changes, and now, blind and bedridden in the ruin, called Malkin Tower, she was living on time borrowed from a world that no longer had use for her. Her daughter, Elizabeth Device, was perhaps 40 years old, though the years showed heavily on her. She had borne 3 children without benefit of a husband who stayed, and she had raised them in poverty so grinding that it had become simply the condition of existence. Her eldest daughter, Alison, was perhaps 18, old enough to have married but with no dowry and no prospects beyond the life her mother and grandmother had lived. The son, James, was simple-minded, slow in speech and thought, capable of work but rarely given the opportunity. And the youngest, Janet, was sharp-eyed and quick, a child who watched everything and remembered, who had learned early that survival meant telling people what they wanted to hear. Malkin Tower stood barely in the forest west of Newchurch, It was less a house than an assemblage of stone and timber that had been added to and patched over generations until its original form was unrecognisable. The roof leaked. The floor was bare earth. Smoke from the fire had blackened the walls to the colour of char. There was no glass in the windows, only wooden shutters that let in cold when closed and wind when open. The family slept together on straw pallets infested with lice, covered with whatever rags they could gather. In winter, they brought the few sheep they owned inside to share the warmth of their bodies. It was a place where poverty had reached its absolute expression, where there was nothing left to sell or pawn, where survival was measured day by day. Old Demdike had made her reputation as a healer and a cunning woman over decades. People came to her when their children sickened, when their cattle went lame, when they suspected they had been cursed by a neighbour. She would mutter prayers in a mixture of English and Latin, words she had learned from her grandmother, words whose meaning she perhaps no longer fully understood. She would prepare poultices from herbs gathered in the forest, yarrow for wounds, willow bark for fever, foxglove for the heart, though it was dangerous and could kill as easily as cure. She would sell charms, a stone with a hole in it to hang over a barn door, a written prayer folded and sewn into cloth to wear against the skin. Sometimes her remedies worked, and sometimes they did not. But when they worked, people remembered and told others, and when they failed, people blamed the illness rather than the cure. But there was another side to her reputation, darker and more profitable. She could curse as well as cure, or so it was said. A farmer who refused to give alms when she came begging might find his cow dead the next morning. A woman who spoke ill of her might lose a child to sudden fever. These were the stories whispered in the villages, impossible to prove but widely believed. And because people believed, they gave when she came to their doors, even when they resented the giving, even when they could barely spare what she demanded. It was a form of protection money, though no one called it that. It was simply how things were done, how the old woman and her family survived. The Chattox family lived a similar existence, though their dwelling was slightly less ruinous. Anne Whittle, old Chattox, was perhaps 70, her face collapsed around the absence of teeth, her body bent from a lifetime of labour and hunger. She had a daughter, Anne Redfern, who had managed to marry a man named Thomas, and they lived in a cottage near the church. Old Chattox had the same reputation as old Demdike, healer, cunning woman and suspected witch. The two families had been rivals for years, each blaming the other when their clients were dissatisfied, each claiming superior power, each threatening the other with curses and worse. The rivalry had turned poisonous years before in a dispute whose original cause no one could quite remember. Some said it began when Chattox was accused of stealing clothes from Malkin Tower. Others said it started with a curse that Demdike had placed on the Chattox family, causing the death of Chattox's husband. The truth was lost in the accumulation of grievances, but the hatred was real enough. The two old women avoided each other when possible, and when they did meet, the air between them crackled with hostility barely contained by the presence of witnesses. Both families survived on a mixture of begging, petty theft and the sale of their supernatural services. They moved through the villages following a familiar circuit, appearing at farms at times when tradition dictated that alms should be given, at harvest time, at the slaughter of pigs in autumn, at the great festivals of the Christian year. They were persistent and shameless, willing to stand at a door until something was given, willing to invoke pity or fear depending on what worked. The farmers and cottagers who fed them did so with mixed feelings. Charity was a Christian duty, but these particular recipients inspired more wariness than compassion. In a society with no organised poor relief, where the parish was supposed to care for its destitute but rarely had the resources to do so adequately, begging was common. But there were gradations of begging. The lame soldier who had fought for the Queen, the widow with small children, the elderly craftsman whose hands no longer worked, these deserved and received sympathy. But women like Demdike and Chattox, who seemed to possess a kind of power even in their powerlessness, who inspired fear as much as pity, occupied an ambiguous position. They were tolerated because to refuse them seemed dangerous, because the risk of a curse was greater than the cost of a bowl of oatmeal. The children of these families grew up knowing they were different, that other children were warned away from them, that doors closed when they approached. Alison Device had never known any other life. She had watched her grandmother grow blind and immobile, had seen her mother age before her time, had understood from an early age that marriage and normal domestic life were not possibilities for someone with her family's reputation. She had learned to beg effectively, to read the mood of potential almsgivers, to know when to retreat and when to persist. She had learned the family trade, the prayers and charms, the herbs and their uses, the performance of cunning that passed for magic. James Device was tall and thin, with a manner that made people uncomfortable. He spoke in a way that suggested his thoughts came slowly, that he struggled to find words for what he meant. In a different time or place he might have been cared for, protected, given work suited to his capacities, but here, in this harsh country, he was simply another mouth to feed, another body to keep from freezing in winter. He worked occasionally, doing the heavy labour that required no thought, carrying loads, digging ditches, tasks a child could direct. The village boys mocked him, and he lacked the wit to defend himself, retreating to Malkin Tower where his mother and grandmother treated him with a rough affection. Janet Device was something else entirely. At 9 years old, she already possessed a sharp intelligence, a quick tongue, and an instinct for self-preservation that the rest of her family lacked. She watched everything, stored information the way a squirrel stores nuts against winter. She understood that her family's position was precarious, that they existed on tolerance that could evaporate without warning. She had learned to curry favour with those who had power over her, to tell people what they wanted to hear, to shift her loyalty according to circumstances. Later, this quality would be called betrayal, but perhaps it was simply clarity, a ruthless assessment of where safety lay. The rivalry between the Demdike and Chattox families was known to everyone in the district. Roger Nowell had heard the stories, knew that each family accused the other of theft, of cursing, of causing death through witchcraft. He had received complaints over the years, but had never pursued them seriously. The accusations were always vague, impossible to prove, and both families seemed equally guilty of intimidation and extortion. Moreover, prosecuting them would require effort and expense, and the Sire were too poor to pay fines even if convicted of lesser charges. Better to let them continue their strange existence, to let the village dynamics handle them in the traditional way. But Roger Nowell was also aware of the changing climate around witchcraft. The king's interest in the subject was well known. Trials in other parts of England had resulted in multiple hangings. In Scotland, where James had been king before inheriting the English throne, the prosecution of witches had been vigorous and brutal. The Berwick witch trials of the 1590s had seen dozens executed on charges of attempting to kill the king through magic. James had attended the examinations personally, had written his demonology partly in response to those events. He believed that witchcraft was not mere superstition, but a real conspiracy between humans and demons, that witches represented a threat to the state as well as to individual victims. A magistrate who successfully prosecuted witches could expect approval from higher authorities, and Roger Nowell was ambitious in the quiet way of provincial gentlemen, hoping for advancement, for recognition, for the notice of men who moved in circles closer to power. But he was also conscientious, educated in the law, aware that accusations alone were insufficient. He needed evidence that would satisfy not just village suspicion, but legal standards. He needed confessions, ideally, or testimony from reliable witnesses. He needed a case that would stand up before judges at the assizes in Lancaster. And so the two families continued their existence through the winter of 1612, begging and cursing and surviving. They had no way of knowing that events were already in motion that would destroy them all. They had no way of understanding that the world was changing in ways that left no room for their particular form of marginal survival. They were old or young, clever or simple, but all of them were trapped in a web of poverty and reputation from which there was no escape. The forest kept them hidden for a while longer, but the shadows were lengthening and spring was coming, bringing with it the encounter on the road that would tear everything apart. Chapter 3. The Pedlar on the Road. The 18th of March in the year 1612 fell on a Wednesday, a day that should have been ordinary, a day that should have vanished into the succession of days that made up that hard spring. John Law rose before dawn in his lodgings in Halifax, assembled his pack of pins and needles, buttons and ribbons, the small trade goods that he carried from town to town, market to market. He was a pedlar, a chapman, a man who made his living by walking the roads of the West Riding of Yorkshire and into Lancashire, selling the necessities and small luxuries that rural people needed but could not make themselves. It was a precarious trade, vulnerable to weather and robbery, requiring strong legs and a tolerance for loneliness, but it was his trade, and he had followed it for years. Halifax lay in a valley carved by the River Hebble, a town of stone houses and fulling mills where wool from the surrounding hills was processed into cloth. The market was held on Saturday, and pedlars like John Law would buy stock there, then carry it outward to farms and villages, too distant to attend the market themselves. He knew his routes, knew which farms would need thread, which households would buy a needle case or a horn comb. The journey to Colne took him west across the moors, a distance of perhaps 10 miles, though the path climbed and descended so many hills that the actual walking was considerably longer. He set out in the early morning, when mist still lay in the valleys, and the sun was a pale disk struggling through cloud. The road was mud in places, stone in others, barely wide enough for a cart, past farms where smoke rose from chimneys, where dogs barked at his passing. He stopped at houses where he was known, made small sales, exchanged news. By midday he had cleared the higher moors and was descending toward Colne, following the road that skirted the southern edge of Pendle Hill. The road here passed through country that was less settled, where the common land extended for miles, where sheep grazed unfenced and the forest encroached from the western slopes. It was territory familiar to John Law. He had walked this road dozens of times, but it was also country where travellers went wary, where the distance between houses meant that a man in trouble could expect no immediate help. He walked steadily, his pack heavy on his shoulders, thinking perhaps of the evening meal he would buy in Colne, of the comfort of sitting down after hours of walking. Alison Device had left Malkin Tower that morning with the same purpose that drew her out most days, to beg. Her grandmother was bedridden, her mother was occupied with trying to coax something edible from their meagre supplies, and so the task of begging fell to Alison. She knew the farms and cottages within walking distance, knew which households were likely to give and which would curse and drive her away. She had learned to accept both outcomes with equal indifference, had developed the thick skin necessary for survival in her position. She had been walking south, away from the forest, following the paths that led between stone walls toward the more prosperous farms near Red Hall. She had received a handful of oatmeal at one house, nothing at 3 others. It was a poor morning, and hunger made her bold, willing to approach strangers rather than return empty-handed to Malkin Tower. When she saw the pedlar on the road, saw his pack and his steady gait, she saw opportunity. Pedlars carried goods, and goods could be begged or stolen. She increased her pace, moving to intercept him where the road narrowed between walls. John Law saw her coming, recognised her for what she was, a beggar, probably from one of the families in the forest. He had encountered such women before, knew their persistence, their willingness to follow and importune. He had no particular malice toward them, but neither did he feel obliged to give to every outstretched hand. He had paid for his stock, had walked miles to sell it, and what little profit he made was earned through effort. He intended to refuse her before she even asked. Alison Device called out to him, asking if he had pins to spare, ribbon she could have. Her voice was polite enough, almost wheedling. John Law stopped, but did not lower his pack. He told her he had nothing to give, that his goods were for selling, not for charity, that she should seek elsewhere. The exchange might have ended there, with Alison turning away disappointed, but unharmed. But something in his manner, perhaps his firmness, perhaps simple bad luck, made her persist. She asked again. He refused again, his voice harder now, and he turned to continue down the road. What happened next would be disputed, interpreted, transformed into evidence, What was certain was this. John Law took perhaps 20 steps before he faltered. His left side went suddenly weak as if the strength had been drawn from it. His leg would not support his weight properly. His arm hung useless. He stumbled, caught himself against the wall, lowered himself to sitting position on the grass verge. The weakness spread, a strange paralysis that left him frightened and confused. He called out, but there was no one near except the beggar woman, who stood watching him with an expression he could not read. Alison Device had not moved. She stood perhaps 20 yards distant, frozen by what she was seeing. The pedlar had refused her, and now the pedlar was struck down, and the two events were separated by less than a minute. In that moment, watching John Law collapse, she felt something rise in her, not quite pride, not quite horror, but a kind of recognition. This was the power her grandmother claimed to possess, the power that made people fear and feed them. This was what it meant to be a Demdike. And if she possessed it, if she'd caused this with her anger, then she was both more dangerous and more valuable than she had known, but she was also frightened. John Law was not dead, but clearly hurt, and someone would ask what had happened, and she had been seen with him, had argued with him. She approached cautiously, asked if he needed help. He looked up at her with the eyes that showed white all around, and he asked what she had done to him. The question hung between them, accusation and confirmation both. She denied it, said she had done nothing, but her voice carried no conviction. And then she turned and ran, leaving the pedlar sitting by the roadside, leaving the moment behind her, but carrying its consequences with her like a brand. John Law sat for perhaps an hour, hoping the weakness would pass, but it did not. Eventually, a farmer with a cart came along the road, saw the pedlar sitting in obvious distress, and stopped to help. John Law told him what had happened. The beggar woman, the refusal, the sudden collapse. The farmer knew immediately what it meant, or thought he did. The woman had cursed the pedlar. This was witchcraft, maleficium, the evil magic that everyone feared. The farmer helped John Law onto his cart, took him to the nearest substantial house, which happened to be an inn at the edge of Colne. There, John Law was put to bed, and his condition was assessed. The paralysis was real, not feigned. His left side remained weak, his face drooped slightly on that side, his speech was slurred. A physician was called eventually, though physicians cost money and John Law was not a wealthy man. The physician could offer no natural explanation for the sudden onset of symptoms, no treatment beyond rest and prayer. The paralysis did not resolve. Days passed, and John Law remained in the inn, unable to walk, unable to continue his trade, dependent on charity, and increasingly convinced that he had been bewitched. Word spread through Colne and back toward Pendle Hill. A pedlar had been cursed by one of the Demdike women. He had refused her alms, and she had struck him down in revenge. The story grew in the telling, acquiring details it had not originally possessed. Some said she had muttered words in a strange language. Others said a black dog had appeared and disappeared. The story reached Roger Nowell at Red Hall within days, brought to him by people who felt that something needed to be done, that this was evidence of the witchcraft everyone had always suspected. Alison Device returned to Malkin Tower in a state of confusion and fear. She told her mother what had happened, or a version of what happened. Elizabeth Device did not seem surprised, nor particularly worried. Such things occurred, she said. The pedlar had refused alms, and misfortune had followed. That was the way of the world, the proof of the power their family possessed. But Alison could not shake the feeling that something had changed, that the balance that had kept them safe had shifted. She remembered the pedlar's face, the accusation in his eyes. She knew that someone would come asking questions, and when they did, she was not sure what she would say. Roger Nowell heard the reports and weighed his options. A pedlar struck down after refusing a beggar woman from a family with a reputation for witchcraft. It was precisely the kind of case that could support a prosecution. But he needed more than rumour. He needed to examine the victim, hear his testimony, and most importantly, he needed to examine the alleged witch herself. He sent men to find Alison Device and bring her to Red Hall for questioning. They found her at Malkin Tower, frightened and alone. Her mother had gone to beg elsewhere, and they brought her without difficulty to stand before the magistrate. Roger Nowell sat in his hall, a room panelled in oak, warmed by a fire larger than anything Alison had ever seen. He was not unkind in his manner, but neither was he sympathetic. He asked her to tell what had happened on the road. And Alison Device, 18 years old, poor and scared and lacking anyone to advise her, made the catastrophic decision to tell the truth as she understood it. She said that she had asked the pedlar for pins. She said he had refused. She said that she had wished harm upon him in her heart, had perhaps, she was not sure, spoken a curse her grandmother had taught her. She said that he had fallen immediately afterward, and that she believed her curse had caused it. She confessed to witchcraft, to possessing the power to harm, because in that moment before the magistrate's authority, confession seemed like the only way to explain what had happened, to make sense of what even she did not fully understand. Roger Nowell wrote down her words, translated them into the formal language of legal deposition. He asked about her grandmother, about old Demdike and the powers she claimed to possess, and Alison, seeking perhaps to deflect guilt from herself, or perhaps simply answering honestly, told the magistrate everything she knew. She said her grandmother had been a witch for decades. She said old Demdike had taught her granddaughter charms and curses. She said the Chattox family possessed similar powers. She said that her grandmother had told her of a familiar spirit, a demon that appeared in the form of a dog. She gave the magistrate everything he needed, and more besides, to build a case not just against herself, but against her entire family. The examination concluded, Roger Nowell ordered Alison Device held in custody. She would not return to Malkin Tower. Within days he ordered that old Demdike, Elizabeth Device and the Chattoxes also be brought in for examination. The machinery of law had been set in motion, and it would grind forward with its own logic, caring nothing for the intentions or understanding of the people caught in its wheels. The pedlar remained paralysed in Colney, evidence of maleficium. The beggar woman sat in custody, her confession recorded, and on Pendle Hill in the forest where the old women lived, there was a sudden silence, as if the very trees were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Chapter 4. The Wammerhorse. Magistrate's Inquiry. Roger Nowell sat in his study at Red Hall and reviewed the deposition he had taken from Alison Device. The girl's confession was damning, not merely for herself, but for her entire family. She had admitted to cursing John Law, had claimed the power to harm through supernatural means, and had implicated her grandmother as the source of that power. More significantly, she had done so voluntarily, without torture or even significant pressure. English law did not permit the use of torture in witchcraft cases, as was common on the continent, but a frightened girl before a magistrate's authority needed no physical coercion to speak. The weight of the moment, the unfamiliar surroundings, the recognition that resistance was futile, these were sufficient to loosen tongues. The magistrate understood that he now possessed the foundation for a significant prosecution. A single case of maleficium against a pedlar might result in one hanging, but if he could establish a pattern of witchcraft, if he could demonstrate that an entire family, or even multiple families, had been practicing harmful magic for years, then the case would attract attention far beyond Lancashire. It would demonstrate vigilance, loyalty to the Crown's interest in suppressing witchcraft, and his own capability as an instrument of justice. He was not a cruel man by the standards of his time, but neither was he burdened by doubt. If these women were witches, as the evidence increasingly suggested, then the law prescribed a remedy, and it was his duty to apply it. He sent his men to bring in Elizabeth Southerns, called old Demdike. They found her at Malkin Tower, blind and barely able to stand, and they carried her, more than led her to Red Hall. She was perhaps 80 years old, though exact ages were uncertain for people of her class, who kept no written records and marked time by seasons and monarchs rather than calendar years. She had outlived most of her generation, had survived famine and plague and the dangerous business of childbirth multiple times, but she had not survived by making enemies of men like Roger Nowell, and she must have known when his men came for her that her long life was reaching its conclusion. The examination took place on the 30th of March. Old Demdike was brought into the hall and placed in a chair, but she could not stand for long. Roger Nowell sat across from her, a clerk beside him to record the proceedings. The questions began gently, establishing her name and residence, her family relationships. Then they moved to more dangerous ground. Had she taught her granddaughter charms and curses? Did she possess the power to harm through supernatural means? Had she made a compact with the devil or with any evil spirit? Old Demdike answered in a voice weakened by age but still clear enough. Perhaps she was past caring about consequences. Perhaps she believed that confession might bring mercy. Perhaps she simply told the truth as she understood it, without recognising how those truths would sound when translated into the language of law and demonology. She said that, yes, she had learned magical arts from her grandmother decades ago when she was a young woman. She said her grandmother had taken her to a place called the Red Bank, near Pendle Hill, and there had introduced her to a spirit that appeared as a boy dressed in fine clothes. She said this spirit had offered to help her, to give her power to harm her enemies and protect her friends, and that she had agreed. She said the spirit had asked her for her soul, and she had given it. The clerk wrote rapidly, recording words that would later be read in court, that would form part of the evidence that condemned her. Roger Nowell listened with the careful attention of a man who recognised significance when he heard it. A familiar spirit, a demonic compact, the exchange of a soul for magical power. These were the elements of witchcraft as defined by law and theology. This was not merely cunning folk magic, not merely the use of herbs and charms that occupied the ambiguous space between medicine and superstition. This was witchcraft proper. The conspiracy with demons that King James himself had written about, that the law punished with death. Old Demdike continued speaking. She said the spirit had remained with her for years, appearing sometimes as a boy, sometimes as a brown dog. She said it had helped her when people came seeking cures or revenge. She said she had used its power to harm those who had offended her. She gave specific instances, naming people who had died or suffered illness after crossing her. Some of these claims were undoubtedly true. People had died, though whether her curses had caused those deaths or whether she was simply taking credit for natural mortality was impossible to determine. But the confession itself was what mattered, the admission of intent and supernatural capability. Roger Nowell asked about the Chattox family. Old Demdike's voice took on a harder edge. Yes, she said, Anne Chattox was also a witch. They had been rivals for years. Chattox had killed several people through witchcraft, including a man named Richard Asherton years ago. She had stolen from Malkin Tower. She had cursed the Demdike family repeatedly. The old woman's testimony transformed from confession to accusation, implicating her rival in crimes matching her own. Whether this was truth or strategic deflection, or simply the continuation of a decades-long feud, made no practical difference. Roger Nowell now had grounds to examine the Chattox family as well. Elizabeth Device, old Demdike's daughter, was brought in next. She was less forthcoming than her mother, more wary of the magistrate's questions. She denied being a witch herself, but admitted that her mother had taught her charms, that she had seen the familiar spirit in the form of a brown dog. She confirmed her mother's story about the Red Bank encounter, said she had heard the tale many times. She spoke of the Chattoxes with hatred, blamed them for her brother's death years before, said they were thieves and murderers who used witchcraft to harm their neighbours. Her testimony was less a confession than a series of accusations, but it served Roger Nowell's purpose by corroborating old Demdike's claims and extending the web of guilt. James Device was examined as well, though his testimony was confused and difficult to follow. He confirmed that his grandmother claimed magical powers, that the family spoke of familiar spirits, that they had feuded with the Chattoxes. His simple manner made him seem both pathetic and dangerous, too foolish to lie convincingly, but also too foolish to understand the consequences of what he was saying. Roger Nowell recorded his words, but likely gave them less weight than the testimony of the others. The son was clearly weak-minded, and while that did not exempt him from prosecution, it made him a less compelling witness. Anne Whittle, called Old Chattox, was brought before the magistrate on the 2nd of April. She was as old as Demdike, as poor, as desperate. The examination followed a similar pattern. Questions about her knowledge of witchcraft, about harm she had caused, about compacts with evil spirits, and Old Chattox, like her rival, confessed. She said she had been a witch for more than 40 years. She said she had been seduced into witchcraft by one of the Demdikes, though she did not specify which one. She said a familiar spirit called Fancy had appeared to her in the form of a man, had promised her power in exchange for her soul. She said she had used that power to kill and to harm, naming specific victims and specific methods. The two old women's confessions mirrored each other in structure, as if they were describing the same template of supernatural activity from opposite sides. Both claimed decades of experience. Both described familiar spirits. Both named victims. Both accused the other of worse crimes. Whether their confessions were accurate descriptions of actual events, whether they believed their own claims, whether they were merely telling Roger Nowell what they thought he wanted to hear, these questions were irrelevant to the legal process. They had confessed to witchcraft, and that confession was sufficient for prosecution. Anne Redfern, Old Chattox's daughter, was examined and denied everything. She said she knew nothing of witchcraft, had never harmed neither through supernatural means, was innocent of all accusations. Her denials made little difference. Her mother had implicated her in some of the killings, had said they worked together. The association with a confessed witch was itself suspicious, and Roger Nowell ordered her held for trial along with the others. Within the span of a few days, Roger Nowell had taken depositions from multiple members of both families. He had confessions, accusations, and corroborating testimony. He had specific instances of maleficium, the pedlar John Law, various deaths attributed to curses, livestock killed by supernatural means. He had descriptions of familiar spirits and demonic compacts. He had everything necessary to forward the case to the assizes, the quarterly sessions where serious criminal cases were tried by visiting judges. The next assizes in Lancaster were scheduled for August, 4 months away. Until then, the accused would be held in Lancaster Castle, the great fortress that served as the county jail. The prisoners were prepared for transport. Old Demdike and Old Chattox could barely walk, so they were placed in a cart. The others walked, bound with rope, guarded by men who watched them, with a mixture of fear and contempt. The journey from Pendle Hill to Lancaster was more than 20 miles across a difficult terrain, taking 2 days with stops at night. The prisoners were given minimal food, water when they asked for it, no comfort beyond what was necessary to keep them alive until trial. They were witches now, not merely poor women, and the label changed how they were treated, stripped away what little human sympathy they might otherwise have received. Lancaster Castle had stood on its hill above the River Lune since Norman times, expanded and reinforced over centuries until it was one of the strongest fortresses in the north. Part of it served as the county jail, with cells built into the thick stone walls, dark chambers where prisoners awaited trial or punishment. The conditions were grim by any standard. The cells were damp and cold even in summer. Prisoners received a daily allowance of bread and water, nothing more unless family members brought food, which was unlikely for prisoners as poor as the Pendle witches. Disease was common in such close quarters, and many prisoners died before their cases came to trial. Old Demdike was placed in a cell with her daughter Elizabeth. Old Chattox and her daughter Anne Redfern shared another. Alison Device was held separately, perhaps because she had confessed so readily, perhaps because she was younger and more likely to survive until August. The cells had no windows except narrow slits too high to see from. The floors were stone, often covered with fouled straw that was changed irregularly. The doors were heavy oak reinforced with iron, locked from outside, opened only to bring food or to remove bodies when prisoners died. The days passed in darkness and cold. Old Demdike fell ill almost immediately, her ancient body unable to withstand the conditions. She had lived her entire life outdoors, in the forest, breathing free air however foul the weather. The confinement in stone walls, the damp, the lack of light, these were worse than any torture. She weakened rapidly, stopped eating, and within a few weeks she was dead. The jailers found her one morning, cold and stiff on the stone floor, her blind eyes still open. They carried her body out and buried it in unmarked ground somewhere on the castle. Grounds. She would not live to see the trial, would not hang, would escape through the only door that remained open to her. Elizabeth Device learned of her mother's death from the jailers, who mentioned it casually, without sympathy. She had no way to mourn properly, no way to arrange for Christian burial, no way to even mark the passing except with tears that no one saw or cared about. She was left with her own fear, her own understanding that what had happened to her mother would likely happen to her, if not through illness, then through the rope. She had no advocate, no one to speak in her defence, no money to hire a lawyer even if that would have helped. She was a poor woman accused of witchcraft, and the machinery of law that had seized her would grind forward until it had consumed her completely. The Chattoxes endured the confinement with the stoic despair of those who had long ago given up expecting better. Old Chattox survived where old Demdike had not, perhaps because she was slightly younger, perhaps through pure chance. She and her daughter rarely spoke. There was nothing to say that would change anything, no comfort to offer that was not a lie. They waited in darkness, marked the passage of time by the arrival of bread and water, and tried not to think about what would happen in August when the judges arrived. Alison Device was alone in her cell, with only her thoughts for company. She had time to reflect on the moment on the road, on the pedlar's collapse, on her decision to confess. She had time to regret. The regret changed nothing. She was 18 years old, and her life had ended before it had properly begun. She had never travelled more than a few miles from Pendle Hill, had never owned anything of value, had never known a day without hunger, and now she sat in a stone cell awaiting trial for witchcraft, and the best she could hope for was a quick death when the time came. Roger Nowell reported his findings to the authorities, detailing the confessions he had obtained, the evidence of maleficium, the demonic compacts. His report was well received. He had done exactly what was expected of a magistrate confronted with witchcraft, had been thorough and efficient, had secured confessions without the complications that torture would have created. He returned to his normal duties, hearing cases of theft and assault, managing his estates, attending to the business that occupied a gentleman in early modern England. The Pendle witches became one item in his ledger of accomplishments, a case successfully handled, evidence of his loyalty to the Crown and his competence in office. On Pendle Hill, the forest seemed quieter with the old women gone. Malkin Tower stood empty, slowly collapsing as weather and neglect did their work. The farms and villages that had given arms to the Demdikes and Chattoxes adjusted to their absence, though some still felt uneasy, wondered whether the curses would persist even with the witches imprisoned. The youngest Device child, Jeanette, had been placed with a family in the parish, too young to be prosecuted but old enough to remember everything. She would play a role later, a role that would determine the fate of those who remained. But for now, through April and May and June, the prisoners waited in Lancaster Castle, and the world outside went on without them, planting crops, shearing sheep, preparing for summer, while the accused witches sat in darkness and counted the days until judgment. Chapter 5. The Meeting at Malkin Tower. Here. Good Friday fell on the 10th of April in the year 1612, a day of solemn observance in the Christian calendar, the day commemorating the crucifixion of Christ. Throughout England, people attended church services, abstained from meat, meditated on the passion and death of their Saviour. It was a day when the boundary between the sacred and the profane was supposed to be especially clear, when good Christians demonstrated their faith through prayer and fasting. It was also, by bitter irony or by design, the day when the remaining members of the Device and Chattox families, along with others connected to them, gathered at Malkin Tower in what would later be described as a witches' Sabbath, a deliberate mockery of Christian holy days. evidence of their allegiance to Satan rather than God. The truth of what happened at Malkin Tower on Good Friday 1612 would be disputed, interpreted through the lens of fear and legal necessity, transformed from a gathering of frightened relatives into proof of conspiracy. But certain facts were undeniable. People did gather at the ruined dwelling in the forest. They did discuss the imprisonment of their family members. They did share a meal, though calling it a feast would be generous given their poverty. And their gathering, however innocent its actual purpose, would be used as evidence that would send more of them to the gallows. Elizabeth Device remained free despite her mother's imprisonment. Roger Nowell had taken her testimony, but had not yet ordered her arrest. Perhaps he felt he had sufficient evidence with those already held, or perhaps he was waiting to see if she would lead him to others. She had returned to Malkin Tower after her examination, though the place now felt haunted by absence. Her mother was in Lancaster, likely dying or already dead, though Elizabeth had no way to know for certain. Her daughter Alison was imprisoned. Her simple son James was with her, and young Janet, the sharp-eyed girl who watched everything. They were barely surviving, with no one to beg for them, no source of food beyond what they could scavenge, or what the parish might grudgingly provide. Word had spread through the network of poor families who occupied the edges of Pendle society. The Demdikes and Chattoxes were in prison, accused of witchcraft. Roger Nowell was asking questions, taking depositions, following connections between families. Others who had associated with the accused, who had reputations for cunning or healing, who had made enemies or threatened neighbours, began to feel exposed. Some fled the district entirely, disappearing into other counties where they were unknown. Others tried to demonstrate innocence through conspicuous piety, attending church regularly, avoiding anyone connected to the imprisoned families. A few, either braver or more desperate, came to Malkin Tower to discuss what could be done. On the morning of Good Friday, perhaps 24 people made their way through the forest to the ruin. They came from scattered cottages and villages, following paths they knew well, arriving in small groups throughout the morning. Some were relatives of the imprisoned, the husband of Anne Redfern, cousins and in-laws of the Devices. Others were neighbours or associates, people who had dealings with the accused families, who feared that suspicion might spread to include them. They came for mutual protection, to share information, to plan some response to the disaster that had overtaken their small community. Among those who came was Alice Nutter, and her presence would prove more significant than that of any other. Alice Nutter was not poor. She was a widow of some property, owning land near Rough Lee, living in a substantial house rather than a hovel. She was literate, respectable by the standards of the district, someone who should have had nothing to do with families like the Demdikes. But she had known them, had perhaps employed old Demdike for healing work, had maintained some connection across the gulf of social class. Her presence at Malkin Tower on Good Friday would be her doom, for it suggested that witchcraft was not confined to the desperate poor, that it could infect even those who should have known better. The gathering was not secret. Too many people moving through the forest, or too much activity at a dwelling usually occupied by only a few, neighbours noticed, and some of those neighbours were already suspicious, already worried about witchcraft spreading like plague. The meeting had no formal structure, no leader directing proceedings. People talked in small groups, worried aloud about the imprisoned, discussed whether anything could be done to secure their release. Some suggested raising money to hire a lawyer, though none of them had money to contribute. Others spoke of appealing to Roger Nowell directly, begging for mercy, though mercy seemed unlikely given what had already occurred. Elizabeth Device had prepared food, what little she could manage. There was stolen mutton, a sheep taken from a nearby farm, killed and butchered crudely. There was bread, probably begged or stolen as well. There was ale, weak and sour. They ate together, these poor and frightened people, sharing what they had in the way that the poor always shared when times were desperate. The meal was not a feast by any reasonable definition, but later it would be described as such, transformed into evidence of celebration of witches, gathering to eat and drink in mockery of Christian solemnity. James Device, the simple son, did something during the gathering that would be remembered and used against him. He announced in his slow and awkward way that he intended to kill Roger Nowell and the jailer at Lancaster Castle. He said he would blow up the castle and free his mother and sister. The threat was absurd, the fantasy of a weak-minded man who had no means to carry out such violence, who had probably never held a weapon more dangerous than a knife for cutting bread. But several people heard him say it, and later they would testify to it, and the threat would be transformed into evidence of conspiracy, of witches plotting murder and destruction. The gathering lasted several hours. Some people left when the food was gone. Others stayed longer, talking in the way that people talk when disaster has struck and there is nothing to be done but talk. By late afternoon, the crowd had dispersed, individuals and small groups making their way back through the forest to their homes. They left believing that nothing significant had occurred, that they had simply met as family and friends to discuss a crisis affecting them all. They did not understand that their gathering had been observed, that reports were already making their way to Roger Nowell, that what they had intended as mutual support would be interpreted as conspiracy. Roger Nowell received word of the Malkin Tower meeting within days. His informants described a large gathering on the Good Friday, a feast, threats against magistrates, plans to free the imprisoned witches. The information confirmed his suspicions that he was dealing not with isolated cases of maleficium, but with an organised group, a coven in the terminology that King James had used in his demonology. A coven meeting on the most solemn day of the Christian year was proof of their allegiance to Satan, their deliberate inversion of Christian practice. It was evidence that justified expanding the prosecution to include everyone who had attended. The magistrate acted quickly. He sent men to arrest Elizabeth Device, her son James, and others who'd been identified as present at Malkin Tower. They came in the night, surrounding the ruin before dawn, seizing the occupants before they could flee. Elizabeth Device was dragged from sleep, given no time to dress properly, bound and led away with her son. Alice Nutter was arrested at her home in Ruffley, the constables arriving with a warrant, treating her with more courtesy than they had shown the Devices, but no less firmly. Others were rounded up over the following days, brought to Red Hall for examination, their names added to the list of accused. The examinations followed the pattern Roger Nowell had established. He asked about the meeting at Malkin Tower, who had attended, what had been said, what had been planned. He asked about witchcraft, about curses and charms, about familiar spirits. Some of those examined confessed readily, hoping that cooperation might bring mercy. Others denied everything, but their denials were undermined by the testimony of those who had already confessed. The web of accusation grew more tangled, each examination producing new names, new connections, until it seemed that half the poor families in the Pendle district were implicated in witchcraft. Elizabeth Device confessed to being a witch, said her mother had taught her, said she had a familiar spirit in the form of a brown dog called Ball. She said the spirit had helped her kill several people over the years, naming victims and describing methods. She said the gathering at Malkin Tower had been planned to discuss freeing the prisoners, that her son James had threatened to kill the magistrate and blow up Lancaster Castle. Her confession was detailed and damning, implicating not only herself but everyone who had attended the meeting. James Device confessed as well, though his confession was harder to follow, his speech confused and his understanding clearly limited. He said he had a familiar spirit, that he had used it to kill, that he had attended the meeting at Malkin Tower and had spoken of destroying the castle. Whether he fully understood what he was saying, whether he was merely repeating what the magistrate wanted to hear, was impossible to determine. But his words were recorded, and they would be used against him. Alice Nutter refused to confess. She said she had done nothing wrong, had harmed no one, was innocent of all charges. She admitted attending the gathering at Malkin Tower, but said it was merely a social visit, that she had known the Device family for years, that there was nothing sinister about it. Her refusal to confess made her more dangerous in some ways, for it suggested defiance, a witch who would not break under examination. Roger Nowell noted her stubbornness and ordered her held for trial. Her property would be forfeit if she was convicted, a consideration that may have influenced the vigour of the prosecution. Witchcraft cases that resulted in the seizure of property from wealthy defendants were viewed more favourably by the Crown than cases involving only the destitute. The youngest member of the Device family, Janet, was brought before the magistrate. She was 9 years old, small for her age, thin from chronic hunger. English law allowed children to testify, though their testimony was generally given less weight than that of adults. But Janet Device proved to be an exceptionally willing witness. She told Roger Nowell everything she knew about her family's practice of witchcraft. She said her mother and grandmother had familiar spirits. She said she had seen them perform magic. She said she had attended the meeting at Malkin Tower and could name everyone who had been there. She testified against her own mother and brother without hesitation, her voice clear and confident, her manner suggesting that she understood exactly what she was doing. Roger Nowell recognised the value of her testimony immediately. A child witnessing against her own family carried particular weight, for it suggested that the crimes were so obvious, so undeniable, that even a child could see them. Jenna's testimony would corroborate the confessions of the adults, would provide independent verification of the conspiracy. The magistrate treated her kindly, praised her for her honesty, promised that she would be protected and cared for, and Janet, seeing clearly where safety lay, gave him everything he wanted. She would be the Crown's star witness at the trial, the one whose testimony would seal the fate of those who remained. By the end of April, Roger Nowell had arrested more than a dozen people connected to the Malkin Tower meeting. Some had confessed to witchcraft, others had been implicated by the confessions of their relatives and neighbours. The case had grown far beyond the original incident with the pedlar John Law. It had become a prosecution of a supposed conspiracy, a coven of witches who had operated in the Pendle district for decades, causing death and destruction through their commerce with demons. The evidence was substantial, multiple confessions, descriptions of familiar spirits, specific instances of maleficium, and the damning fact of the Good Friday gathering at Malkin Tower. The accused were transported to Lancaster Castle to join those already imprisoned. The cells grew more crowded, multiple prisoners sharing spaces designed for one or two. Old Demdike was already dead, her body disposed of, her place taken by new arrivals. The prisoners could hear each other through the stone walls, could call out occasionally though the jailers discouraged communication. They existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor yet dead, waiting for August when the judges would arrive and their fates would be determined. In the villages around Pendle Hill, people whispered about the arrests, about the evidence being gathered, about the trial that would come. Some felt vindicated, believed that dangerous witches were finally being brought to justice. Others felt uneasy, wondered whether the prosecutions would stop with the obvious suspects or whether suspicion would continue spreading, whether an accusation from a frightened neighbour might be enough to destroy anyone. The social fabric that had always been fragile in these poor communities grew more strained. Trust eroded. People avoided each other, feared casual conversation might be misinterpreted, reported as evidence of conspiracy. Roger Nowell compiled his evidence, organised the depositions, prepared the case for presentation to the assizes. He corresponded with the clerk of the court in Lancaster, ensuring that the judges would have all necessary documentation. He was thorough and methodical, aware that this case would be scrutinised, that it represented the largest witchcraft prosecution in England in years. He wanted no errors, a procedure that might allow the guilty to escape. He wanted a conviction rate that would demonstrate his competence and loyalty, and he was confident that he would achieve it, for the evidence seemed overwhelming, the guilt of the accused undeniable by any reasonable standard of judgment. Chapter 6. The Spreading Accusation. The arrests that followed the Malkin Tower gathering created a climate of fear that spread far beyond the immediate families involved. Witchcraft accusations possessed a peculiar momentum once initiated, each confession or examination producing new names, new connections, until the investigation took on a life independent of its origins. What had begun with a pedlar struck down on a country road had metastasised into a comprehensive prosecution of the poor and marginal people of the Pendle district, and the machinery of accusation showed no sign of stopping until it had consumed everyone touched by suspicion. The contagion of accusation affected families who had thought themselves safe, who had maintained distance from the Demdikes and Chattoxes, who attended church and paid their tithes and tried to live within the bounds of respectability. But in the atmosphere of fear that gripped the district in the spring of 1612, past associations became dangerous. Old grudges found new expression, and the label of witch became a weapon that could be deployed against anyone who lacked powerful protectors. The prosecution expanded beyond Pendle Hill itself, reaching into neighbouring parishes, drawing in people who had never met old Demdike or Chattox, but who had made the mistake of being known as cunning folk or of having made enemies willing to testify against them. Among those newly accused was Margaret Pearson of Padiham, a village several miles from Pendle Hill. She was known as a healer, someone who treated illnesses in humans and animals using herbs and charms. She had no connection to the Malkin Tower meeting, had never associated with the Device or Chattox families, but she had been accused before of causing harm through witchcraft, and those old accusations now resurfaced in the climate of heightened suspicion. A mare had died after she had supposedly looked at it. A child had sickened after she had touched it. The evidence was thin, the accusations dated, but they were sufficient to bring her before Roger Nowell for examination. Margaret Anna Pearson denied being a witch but admitted to practising healing arts. She said she used prayers and natural remedies, nothing more sinister. But the distinction between legitimate healing and witchcraft was increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of determined prosecution. Roger Nowell questioned her about her methods, about where she had learned her skills, about whether she had familiar spirits or had made compacts with demons. She continued to deny the more serious charges, but her admission that she practiced folk healing was enough to mark her as suspicious. She was held for a trial along with the others charged with using witchcraft to kill a mare, though the penalty for animal maleficium was less severe than for causing human death. In Samlesbury, another parish in Lancashire, 3 women were accused of witchcraft in circumstances that revealed the ease with which accusations could be manufactured and believed. Jane Southworth, Janet Brierley, and Ellen Brierley were accused by a 14-year-old girl named Grace Sourbuts, who claimed the women were witches who had killed a child and performed various acts of maleficium. The Samlesbury case was separate from the Pendle prosecutions, arising from different circumstances, but it was swept into the same assizes, tried before the same judges, part of the same wave of witchcraft prosecution that was overwhelming Lancashire in the summer of 1612. Grace Sourbuts' accusations were particularly lurid. She claimed that the 3 women had transformed themselves into dogs, that they had attempted to force her to drown herself, that they had taken a child and consumed its flesh. The accusations bore the marks of Catholic influence. Grace had been instructed by a Jesuit priest, and her testimony echoed continental witch-hunting narratives more than English folk beliefs. The case was suspicious from the start, suggesting that the accusations were motivated by religious conflict rather than genuine belief in witchcraft. But in the climate of 1612, with King James's known interest in witchcraft and the success of the Pendle prosecutions, the accusations were taken seriously enough to bring the 3 women to trial. Back in Pendle, Roger Nowell continued his examinations. Each prisoner who confessed was asked to name accomplices, to identify others who had been present at the Malkin Tower meeting, or who were known to practice witchcraft. Some named names readily, hoping that cooperation would earn them mercy, or at least better treatment. Others resisted, but resistance was difficult to maintain in the face of leading questions, isolation, and the weight of authority. The magistrate had refined his technique through multiple examinations, knew how to frame questions to elicit the answers he needed, how to use silence and patience to wear down resistance. Catherine Hewitt, called here Moleheels, was arrested and examined. She was accused of having been present at Malkin Tower on Good Friday, of being part of the conspiracy to free the imprisoned witches. She initially denied the charges, but when confronted with testimony from others who claimed to have seen her there, she broke down and confessed. She said she had attended the meeting, had eaten the stolen mutton, had heard James Device threaten Roger Nowell. Her confession added another name to the list of those who would stand trial in August. John Bulcock and his mother Jane Bulcock were arrested together, accused of witchcraft and of attending the Malkin Tower meeting. They were from a slightly better class than the Demdike, owning a small piece of land, but poverty had reduced them to circumstances not much better than those of the forest families. They both confessed under examination, said they had familiar spirits, admitted to using witchcraft to harm their neighbours. Whether their confessions were true or simply the product of fear and pressure was impossible to determine, but once given, the confessions could not be withdrawn without making matters worse. The steady accumulation of confessions and accusations created a picture of widespread witchcraft in the Pendle district, a network of conspirators who had operated for years without detection, causing untold harm to their Christian neighbours. The picture was almost certainly exaggerated, the product of false confessions, leading questions, old grudges given new life, and the natural human tendency to find patterns even in random events. But to Roger Nowell, and to the authorities reviewing his findings, the evidence seemed clear and damning. Lancashire had a witchcraft problem, and aggressive prosecution was the solution. In the cells of Lancaster Castle, the prisoners waited in conditions that grew worse as their numbers increased. The jailers provided minimal food and made no effort to maintain sanitation. Disease spread quickly in such close quarters. Prisoners developed fevers, coughs, infections from untreated wounds and vermin bites. Some grew delirious, talking to themselves or to invisible companions. The line between sanity and madness blurred in the darkness and confinement. Those who had confessed wondered whether they had done the right thing, whether confession would indeed bring mercy or whether they had simply sealed their own fates. Those who maintained their innocence wondered how long they could hold out, whether anyone would believe them when the time came to present their defence. Alice Nutter remained among those who refused to confess. She was housed separately from the poorest prisoners, given slightly better conditions by virtue of her social status, but she was still imprisoned, still accused of capital crimes. She must have understood that her refusal to confess would count against her at trial, that juries expected witches to confess when confronted with evidence. But she maintained her dignity and her denial, insisting that she had done nothing wrong, that attending a gathering of neighbours did not constitute witchcraft. Her determination would prove futile in the end, but it marked her as different from most of the accused, someone who would not break under pressure. The examinations continued through May and into June. Roger Nowell was thorough, determined to build a case so comprehensive that no jury could doubt the guilt of the accused. He took depositions from neighbours who claimed to have been cursed or harmed by the prisoners. He recorded stories of illness and death that followed encounters with the accused. He documented the theft of property, threats made, suspicious behaviour observed over years. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. Dozens of instances of alleged maleficium stretching back decades, all attributed to the small group of families now imprisoned in Lancaster Castle. The children of the accused families were questioned extensively. Besides Janet Device, other children testified about what they had witnessed in their homes, the charms and curses their parents had used, the familiar spirits they claimed to have seen. Children were considered unreliable witnesses in general, prone to fantasy and easily influenced, but in witchcraft cases their testimony was often given great weight. The reasoning was that children were innocent, less likely to lie about such serious matters, and more likely to have witnessed their parents' secret practices. The logic was circular and self-serving, but it was accepted by courts throughout Europe and England. Children's testimony had sent many witches to their deaths, and it would do so again in Lancashire. The accused had no effective means of mounting a defence. They had no lawyers, for English law at the time did not provide counsel for criminal defendants. They had no money to hire investigators or to compel witnesses to testify on their behalf. They had no education that would allow them to understand the legal proceedings, or to counter the case being built against them. They were poor, mostly illiterate, without social connections to anyone who might intervene on their behalf. They were alone against the full weight of law and authority, and that weight was crushing them methodically. Some of the accused tried to retract their confessions, claiming they had been frightened or confused, that they had said what the magistrate wanted to hear, but that it was not true. These retractions were recorded, but given little credence. The law assumed that confessions were true and retractions were lies, that witches would naturally try to escape punishment by denying their earlier admissions. The retraction of a confession was itself suspicious, evidence of the devil's influence, of the witch's determination to protect herself and her accomplices, even in the face of damnation. In the villages and farms around Pendle Hill, life continued with a surface normalcy that belied the fear underneath. Crops were planted and tended, animals were grazed on the commons, markets were held, but conversations were more guarded now, and people were careful about what they said and to whom. An offhand comment about misfortune, a mention of old grievances, even the possession of herbs that might be used in healing. Any of these could be twisted into evidence of witchcraft if someone chose to report it. The social bonds that allowed poor communities to function had been damaged, perhaps irreparably, by the wave of accusations. Roger Nowell felt satisfied with the progress of his investigation. He had identified and arrested more than a dozen witches, had obtained confessions, from most of them had documented a conspiracy that had operated in his jurisdiction for decades. The case would bring him recognition, would demonstrate his loyalty to the crown and his effectiveness as a magistrate. He had done his duty as he understood it, had protected his community from supernatural harm, had enforced the law against witchcraft as Parliament and the King demanded, that the accused were poor, desperate people whose confessions had been obtained through isolation and fear, that many of them probably believed in their own magical powers because they had no other source of status or identity, that the evidence was largely spectral and based on the testimony of frightened neighbours and coerced children. These considerations did not trouble him. The law was clear and he had followed it. The summer of 1612 wore on, hot and dry after the wet spring. In Lancaster Castle, the prisoners marked time by the changing quality of light that filtered through the high, narrow windows, by the sounds of the city beyond their walls, by the lessening and growing of hunger as food was delivered or withheld. They knew the assizes were approaching, that judges were coming from London, that their cases would be heard and decided. Some prayed for mercy, though they had little reason to expect it. Some had given up hope entirely and simply endured, waiting for the end. And some, like Alice Nutter, maintained their innocence with a stubbornness that was either courage or a failure to understand the inevitable outcome. The accusations had spread as far as they were going to spread. The prosecutions had reached their natural limit, constrained by the capacity of Lancaster Castle to hold prisoners and by the approaching date of the assizes. Roger Nowell compiled his evidence, organised the depositions and confessions, prepared to present the case to the judges. The accused had no idea what awaited them in the courtroom, had no understanding of legal procedure or the rules of evidence. They would stand before men in robes who spoke in Latin and legal formulas, who would decide their fates based on testimony they would barely understand, and when it was over most of them would hang, their bodies displayed on the moors as warning to others who might be tempted to make compacts with demons or to harm their neighbours through supernatural means. Chapter 7. The Journey to Lancaster. The summer roads of Lancashire were dry and hard by late July. The mud of spring baked into ruts that made walking difficult for those who travelled on foot. The prisoners who had been held at Red Hall and in other temporary confinements were gathered for the journey to Lancaster Castle, where the assizes would be held in mid-August. They were bound with rope, their hands tied before them, linked together in a chain so that none could flee without dragging the others. The guards who accompanied them were local men, farmers and labourers hired for the task, armed with cudgels and pikes, watching their tories with a mixture of fear and contempt that made them harsh in their treatment. Elizabeth Device walked in the chain with her son James beside her. She had been held in a cell beneath Red Hall for weeks, given little food and less comfort, and the journey to Lancaster felt like a march toward execution, though the trial had not yet occurred. Her feet were bare, her clothing was filthy, and her body had been weakened by confinement until she could barely manage the miles they were required to cover each day. James was stronger physically, his simple mind perhaps protecting him from the full understanding of what was happening. but he stumbled often, pulled along by the rope that connected him to the others, responding to the guards' shouts with confused apologies. Alice Nutter travelled in the same chain, but was treated with marginally more respect. She wore shoes and a cloak, had been allowed to bring a small bundle of possessions, and the guards addressed her as mistress, rather than using the crude names they called the others. But she was still a prisoner accused of witchcraft, still bound and guarded, still making the same journey toward the same destination. Her face showed the strain of imprisonment, the sleepless nights and constant fear, but she held herself upright and did not complain about the pace or the conditions. She had determined to maintain her dignity regardless of what came, and that determination gave her a kind of strength that the others lacked. The Bulcocks, mother and son, walked together in the chain. Jane Bulcock was perhaps 60 years old, her body bent from a lifetime of labour, and the journey was agony for her. She fell repeatedly, dragging down those linked to her, earning curses from the guards who pulled her roughly to her feet and drove her forward. Her son John tried to support her, to take some of her weight, but his own strength was limited, and the guards forbade him from helping too much, said they would not tolerate delays. They walked from dawn until dusk with only brief stops for water and rest, covering perhaps 15 miles in a day, sleeping at night in barns or outer buildings, where they were locked in and guarded until morning. Catherine Hewitt walked in silence, her face set in an expression of resignation that suggested she had already accepted her fate. She had confessed to witchcraft, had named others in her confession, and now she waited to see whether that cooperation would earn her any mercy. She did not speak to the other prisoners except when necessary, did not meet their eyes, existed in a state of internal withdrawal that was perhaps the only way she could endure what was happening. The other prisoners from Pendle made the same journey in separate groups, brought from the various places they had been held, converging on Lancaster from different directions. Those who had been imprisoned in Lancaster Castle since March or April remained where they were, waiting in their cells for the arrival of the judges and the beginning of the assizes. Old Chattox and her daughter Anne Redfern had survived the months of confinement, though old Chattox had grown weaker, her body failing slowly in the darkness and damp. Alison Device had been held in solitary confinement for so long that she had lost track of time, marked the days only by the delivery of bread and water, had no idea how many others had been arrested, or what evidence existed against her beyond her own confession. The journey took 3 days for those walking from Pendle, 3 days of pain and exhaustion and fear. They passed through villages where people came out to watch them, to stare at the witches being brought to justice, to make signs against evil or to throw stones and garbage. Children ran alongside the chain of prisoners, shouting accusations and curses, and the guards did nothing to stop them. At night, locked in whatever structure the guards had commandeered, the prisoners huddled together for warmth and whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to find hope in circumstances that offered none. Elizabeth Device asked the guards what would happen at the trial, how they would be judged, whether they would be allowed to speak in their own defence. The guards knew little about legal procedure and cared less, told her to shut her mouth and save her questions for the judges. She asked about her mother, whether old Demdike was still alive, and the guards laughed and said the old woman had died months ago, buried in the ground like the witch she was. Elizabeth received this news without visible reaction, had perhaps expected it, had already mourned her mother in the privacy of her own thoughts, but the confirmation of the death added her another weight to the burden she carried, another loss in a life that had been constructed entirely from loss. James Device asked repeatedly where they were going, why they were walking so far, when they would be allowed to return home. His mother tried to explain, but her explanations only confused him more. He could not grasp the concept of a trial, of judges determining guilt, of the possibility that they might be hanged. His mind understood immediate physical reality, hunger, exhaustion, the rope binding his wrists, but could not extend to encompass the legal and social mechanisms that had trapped them all. He walked because the guards forced him to walk, stopped when they allowed him to stop, and tried to make sense of a world that had become incomprehensible. Lancaster came into view on the afternoon of the third day, the castle visible from miles away, dominating the landscape from its position on the hill above the River Lune. It was an ancient fortress, rebuilt and expanded over centuries, its walls thick enough to withstand siege, its towers rising high above the surrounding country. Part of it served as the jail, with cells built into the foundation and lower levels, chambers designed to hold prisoners securely while they awaited trial or punishment. The prisoners saw it growing larger as they approached, this stone mass that would be their home until the trial concluded, and whatever courage they had maintained during the journey began to fail them. The castle gates stood open during the day, allowing traffic to pass in and out, but the prisoners were not brought through the main entrance. They were led around to a smaller gate that opened directly into the jail section, were marched down stone steps into corridors that grew darker as they descended. The smell was overwhelming. Human waste, rotting straw, the accumulated filth of dozens of prisoners held in inadequate space with minimal sanitation. The guards removed the rope that had linked the prisoners together, but left their hands bound as they were pushed into cells. Elizabeth Device and her son James were separated, placed in different cells. She called out to him as the guards dragged him away, tried to tell him she would see him soon, but the heavy oak doors closed between them, and her voice could not penetrate the stone. She was placed in a cell with 3 other women, all accused of various crimes, all waiting for the assizes. The cell was perhaps 10 feet square, with no furniture, no light except what filtered through a narrow slit high in one wall, no amenities beyond a bucket in the corner that served as a latrine. The floor was covered with straw that had not been changed in weeks, crawling with lice and other vermin. The walls were damp, slick with moisture that never dried, and the air was thick and foul. Alice Nutter was given a cell alone, a concession to her social status. It was no larger than the cells that held multiple prisoners, equally dark and damp, but the solitude was a mixed blessing. She had no one to talk to, no human contact beyond the jailers who brought food once a day and emptied the bucket when it overflowed. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sounds of other prisoners, the screams and sobs and muttered prayers that echoed through the stone corridors. She had time to think, too much time to replay the events that had brought her to this place, to wonder what she might have done differently, to understand that no different action would have changed the outcome once the accusations had been made. The jailers were crude men who had worked in the castle for years, who had seen hundreds of prisoners pass through on their way to execution, who had developed a callousness that allowed them to treat human suffering as routine. They were not actively cruel by the standards of the time, did not torture prisoners unnecessarily, but neither did they show kindness or mercy. They brought bread and water daily, collected the dead when prisoners died, maintained minimal order in the cells, and looked forward to the assizes as the event that would empty the jail and allow them to clean out the accumulated filth before the next batch of prisoners arrived. Alison Device learned that her mother and brother had arrived, that they were imprisoned somewhere in the same complex of cells, but she had no way to reach them or communicate with them. She had been held in isolation for so long that human contact had become almost painful, the sound of other voices startling and overwhelming. She had confessed to witchcraft months ago, in what seemed like another life, and she could not remember clearly what she had said, whether she had implicated her family, whether her words had helped create the situation they now faced. The guilt of that uncertainty was worse than the physical discomfort of imprisonment, a weight that pressed on her constantly. The other prisoners from Pendle were distributed among the available cells. The Bullcocks were separated, Jane placed with the women, John with the men. Catherine Hewitt was placed in a crowded cell where the other prisoners knew she was accused of witchcraft and treated her with suspicion and hostility. Old Chattox and Anne Redfern remained in the cell they had occupied for months, barely aware that new prisoners had arrived, locked in their own private suffering. The castle jail now held approximately 24 prisoners accused of witchcraft, the largest such group ever assembled in England for a single trial. The assizes were scheduled to begin on the 17th of August. The judges would arrive from London in the days before, travelling the northern circuit that brought royal justice to the distant counties. They would hear all the criminal cases that had accumulated since the last assizes, cases of murder and robbery and assault, as well as the witchcraft cases. The trials would be conducted according to established legal procedure, with indictments read, evidence presented, witnesses examined, and juries empanelled to determine guilt or innocence. The entire process would take several days, and at the end of it, those found guilty would be sentenced according to law. Roger Nowell arrived in Lancaster several days before the assizes began, bringing with him the depositions and confessions he had collected, the evidence that would be presented against the accused. He met with the clerk of assize, reviewed the procedures, ensured that everything was in order. He would serve as the primary witness for the prosecution, would testify about the examinations he had conducted, would introduce the confessions into evidence. He was confident of the outcome, had no doubt that the juries would find the accused guilty based on the overwhelming evidence of their own words and the testimony of their neighbours. Janet Device was brought to Lancaster with her guardian, the family who had taken custody of her after her mother's arrest. She was kept in comfortable lodgings, not in the castle jail, and was treated well by the authorities who understood the value of her testimony. She would be the star witness at the trial, the child who would testify against her own family, whose words would carry weight precisely because they seemed to violate natural affection. She was coached on what to say, how to present herself, though the coaching was perhaps unnecessary. Jenna understood instinctively what was required of her, knew that her survival depended on pleasing those who had power over her, and she was prepared to give them whatever testimony they needed. The judges appointed to hear the cases were Sir James Altham and Sir Edward Bromley, both experienced jurists who had heard witchcraft cases before, who understood the law and the evidence required for conviction. They arrived in Lancaster on the 15th of August, were received by the mayor and corporation with ceremony appropriate to their status, and took up residence in accommodations prepared for them. They reviewed the calendar of cases to be heard, noted the large number of witchcraft accusations, and prepared for what would clearly be the most significant witchcraft trial in recent English history. In the cells beneath the castle, the prisoners waited. Some prayed, reciting the prayers they had learned as children, appealing to God or the Virgin or the saints for mercy. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed by fear and hopelessness. Some sat in silence, conserving their strength for the ordeal ahead. Elizabeth Device thought about her mother, dead and buried somewhere on the castle grounds, and about her children, scattered and destroyed by the accusations that had torn their family apart. She had confessed to witchcraft because confession had seemed like the path to mercy, but she was beginning to understand that no mercy was coming, that the machinery she had helped set in motion would grind forward until it had consumed them all. Alice Nutter maintained her composure and her denial. She would not confess to crime she had not committed, would not implicate others to save herself. When the trial came, she would speak the truth and trust that the truth would be sufficient defence. It was a naive hope, the product of her slightly higher social status and education, her belief that the law operated according to rational principles. She would learn otherwise in the days ahead, would discover that witchcraft trials followed their own logic, that innocence was no protection against determined prosecution and frightened juries. The night before the trial began, the prisoners could hear unusual activity in the castle above them, the sound of preparations being made, of people gathering for the spectacle. The assizes were public events, drawing crowds from throughout the region. People who came to watch justice being dispensed, to see criminals punished, to participate in the ritual affirmation of law and order. Witchcraft trials were particularly popular, offering both moral instruction and entertainment, the spectacle of evil being confronted and defeated. The prisoners in their cells could not see the crowds gathering, but they could hear the murmur of voices, the sound of many people, and they knew that their suffering would be observed by hundreds who had come to witness their judgment. Chapter 8. The trial begins. The 17th of August in the year 1612 dawned clear and warm, the kind of late summer day when the air held the first hint of the coming autumn, when the light had a particular quality that made everything seem sharp-edged and significant. Lancaster Castle stood on its hill as it had for centuries, But on this morning it was the centre of attention for miles around, for the assizes had come and justice would be dispensed. The great hall within the castle had been prepared for the trials, benches arranged for spectators, a raised platform for the judges, a dock where the accused would stand, space for the jury and for witnesses. By early morning people were already gathering, filling the available seats and crowding into the standing areas, eager to witness the prosecution of the Pendle witches. The judges entered with the ceremony appropriate to their office, preceded by the sheriff and attended by clerks and bailiffs. Sir James Altham and Sir Edward Bromley wore their robes of office, the formal dress that marked them as representatives of the King's justice, empowered to hear cases and pass sentence according to law. They took their seats on the raised platform, surveyed the crowded hall and signalled that the proceedings could begin. The clerk of assize stood and called for order, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation, and the hall fell silent as the first case was announced. The witchcraft trials would not be heard first. The assizes dealt with all serious criminal matters, and the calendar had to be worked through in order. Murder cases, robbery, assault, these were heard first, while the accused witches remained in their cells below, listening to the muffled sounds of the proceedings above them, waiting for their names to be called. The waiting was its own form of torture, the anticipation worse in some ways than the event itself, allowing fear to grow and multiply until it consumed all other thoughts. The trials above proceeded with the mechanical efficiency of a legal system that had refined its procedures over centuries. Indictments were read listing the crimes in formal Latin, followed by English translation. Prisoners were brought up from the cells, made to stand in the dock, asked how they pleaded. Witnesses testified, were examined and cross-examined and in the limited way that the law allowed. Juries deliberated briefly and returned verdicts. Sentences were pronounced. Some prisoners were acquitted and released. Others were found guilty and sentenced to hang, the execution to take place within days. The judges moved through the cases without apparent emotion, applying the law as it had been written, fulfilling their function as instruments of royal justice. It was not until the 19th of August that the witchcraft, or cases, were called. The first to be tried were the women from Samlesbury, Jane Southworth, Janet Brierly and Ellen Brierly, accused by the 14-year-old Grace Sowerbutts of transforming into animals and killing a child. The three women were brought up from the cells and placed in the dock, blinking in the light after months of darkness, facing a hall packed with spectators who stared at them with fascination and horror. The indictment was read, charging them with using witchcraft to kill and with consorting with familiar spirits. They pleaded not guilty, their voices barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Grace Sowerbutts was called to testify. She told her story with the confidence of someone who had been well coached, describing how the three women had appeared to her in the forms of black dogs, how they had tried to force her to drown herself, how she had witnessed them take a child and devour its flesh. The testimony was spectacular and disturbing, and the spectators listened in rapt attention. But the judges were more experienced than the crowd, and they pressed the girl with questions that revealed inconsistencies in her account. Under examination it emerged that Grace had been instructed by a Catholic priest, that her testimony had been shaped to serve religious and personal grudges rather than reflecting genuine experience. The judges conferred briefly and then did something unusual. They questioned the priest who had instructed Grace, examined the motivations behind the accusations, and determined that the charges were malicious and false. The three women from Samlesbury were acquitted, found not guilty, and released from custody. They walked from the castle as free women, though their reputations had been destroyed and their lives disrupted by months of imprisonment. The acquittal was unusual enough to be noted, a demonstration that the judges were not simply convicting everyone accused of witchcraft, that evidence mattered and that false accusations could be identified and rejected. But the acquittal of the Samlesbury witches did not bode well for the Pendle accused, for their cases were substantially different. The Samlesbury women had maintained their innocence consistently, had been accused by a single questionable witness, and had no confessions or corroborating evidence against them. The Pendle witches had confessed, had implicated each other, had been accused by multiple witnesses, including their own family members. The judges would apply the same legal standards, but the evidence in the Pendle cases was far more damaging. Anne Whittle, called Old Chattox, was brought up first from the Pendle group. She was perhaps 75 years old, barely able to stand, her body wasted by months of imprisonment. She was placed in the dock and the indictment was read, charging her with using witchcraft to kill 4 people over a period of years. She was asked how she pleaded, and in a voice that could barely be heard she said guilty. The confession she had given to Roger Nowell months earlier was read into evidence, describing her familiar spirit called Fancy, the deaths she claimed to have caused, the decades she had practiced witchcraft. There was no real trial in the modern sense, no presentation of defence, no cross-examination of witnesses. The confession was sufficient. The jury was instructed on the law, deliberated briefly, and returned a verdict of guilty. Anne Redfern, Old Chattox's daughter, was tried next. She had maintained her innocence, had refused to confess, but her mother's testimony had implicated her in several of the killings. Witnesses were called who described deaths and illnesses that had followed encounters with Anne Redfern, who testified that she had cursed them or their family members. The evidence was circumstantial, based on suspicion and correlation rather than proof of causation, but in witchcraft cases such evidence was considered sufficient. The jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to hang alongside her mother. Elizabeth Device was brought up from the cells, squinting in the light, her clothing filthy and her body weakened by imprisonment. She saw the crowd staring at her, saw the judges in their robes, saw Roger Nowell sitting among the witnesses, and she understood that there would be no mercy here. The indictment charged her with multiple murders through witchcraft, with possessing a familiar spirit, with conspiring with others to kill and harm. Her confession was read, describing the brown dog called Ball, the deaths she claimed to have caused, the meeting at Malkin Tower on Good Friday. The testimony was damning because it was her own words, spoken to Roger Nowell months earlier, now being used to destroy her. But the prosecution was not finished. Janet Device was called to testify, the 9-year-old daughter who would speak against her mother. The child was brought into the hall, small and thin, dressed in clean clothes provided by her guardians, coached to present herself as innocent and truthful. She was placed where everyone could see her, and the questions began. Did she know the woman in the dock? Yes, that was her mother. Had she seen her mother practice witchcraft? Yes, many times. Did her mother have a familiar spirit? Yes, a brown dog called Ball that appeared when her mother called it. Had her mother attended the meeting at Malkin Tower on Good Friday? Yes, and Janet could name everyone who had been there. The child's testimony was delivered clearly, without hesitation, her voice carrying through the hall. She looked at her mother while she spoke, met her eyes without flinching, and detailed the evidence that would send Elizabeth Device to the gallows. The spectators watched in fascinated horror, for there was something particularly disturbing about a child testifying against her own parent, something that violated natural order and yet seemed to confirm the unnatural character of witchcraft itself. Elizabeth Device stood in the dock and listened to her daughter destroy her, tears running down her face, unable to speak in her own defence, unable to do anything but witness her own condemnation. The jury required no time for deliberation. The confession and the child's testimony left no room for doubt. They returned a verdict of guilty, and Elizabeth Device was sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead. She was led back to the cells, her legs barely supporting her weight, the guards having to drag her down the stone steps. She had confessed to save herself, had implicated others in the hope of mercy, and had received nothing but the judgment she had helped create. Her daughter had testified against her not from malice, but from the clear-eyed recognition of where safety lay, and that betrayal was worse than any other pain she had endured. James Device was brought up next, his confusion evident in every movement. He did not understand the proceedings, could not follow the legal language, responded to questions with answers that made little sense. His confession was read, describing threats he had made against Roger Nowell and the castle, his claim to possess a familiar spirit in the form of a black dog. Witnesses testified that they had heard him threaten violence at the Malkin Tower meeting. His sister Janet testified against him as she had against their mother, describing his practice of witchcraft, his use of a familiar spirit, his participation in the conspiracy. The verdict was inevitable. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang, led back to the cells, still not fully comprehending what had happened. Alice Nutter was brought before the judges, and the hall grew quieter as people recognised that this case was different. She was not from the poor families, not dressed in rags, not bent by age and privation, which had stood upright in the dock, met the judge's eyes, and pleaded not guilty in a clear voice. The indictment charged her with murder through witchcraft, with attending the meeting at Malkin Tower, with being part of the conspiracy. But unlike the others, she had no confession. The prosecution relied on the testimony of those who claimed to have seen her at Malkin Tower, on circumstantial evidence connecting her to the Device family, on the assumption that a woman of her status would not associate with known witches unless she was herself a witch. Alice Nutter attempted to defend herself, to explain that she had known the Device family, that she had visited Malkin Tower occasionally out of Christian charity or to purchase healing services, that attending a gathering of neighbours did not constitute witchcraft. But her defence was undermined by the confessions of the others who had named her as present at the meeting, who had implicated her in their conspiracy. The law of the time allowed for guilt by association in witchcraft cases, assumed that respectable people did not consort with witches unless they were themselves engaged in the same practices. The jury deliberated longer in her case than in the others, perhaps troubled by the lack of direct evidence, but ultimately returned a verdict of guilty. Alison Device was tried for the cursing of John Law, the pedlar whose collapse on the road had initiated the entire prosecution. She had confessed to the crime months earlier, had admitted that she wished harm upon the pedlar, and believed her curse had struck him down. John Law was brought into the hall still suffering the effects of the stroke or whatever had afflicted him, his left side weakened, his speech impaired. He testified that he had been healthy until he refused the beggar woman's request, that the paralysis had struck immediately after, that he believed he had been bewitched. Alison's confession was read, and the evidence was considered sufficient for conviction. She was found guilty and sentenced to hang. The Bulcocks, mother and son, were tried together. Both had confessed to being witches, to possessing familiar spirits, to causing harm through supernatural means. The confessions were read. Witnesses testified to deaths and illnesses that had followed encounters with them, and the jury quickly returned guilty verdicts for both. Catherine Hewitt, called Mould Heels, was tried on similar evidence, her confession and the testimony of neighbours sufficient to convict her. One by one, the accused were brought before the judges, tried according to the established procedures, and found guilty based on their own words and the words of those who had implicated them. By the end of the day, on the 20th of August, 10 people had been convicted of witchcraft and sentenced to death. Old Chattox and her daughter Anne Redfern, Elizabeth Device, her son James and her daughter Alison, Alice Nutter, Jane and John Bulcock, Catherine Hewitt, and one other, Isabel Roby, from the nearby parish of Windle, whose case had been heard along with the others. 10 people who would hang on the moors above Lancaster within days, their bodies displayed as warning and example. The sentences were pronounced with the formal language that the law required, and the condemned were led back to their cells to await execution. Margaret Pearson, accused of using witchcraft to kill a mare, was tried separately and found guilty of the lesser charge of animal maleficium. The penalty was not death, but public humiliation. She was sentenced to be pilloried in the markets of Clitheroe, Padiham and Lancaster, standing in the stocks for hours while the public mocked and pelted her with garbage. It was a harsh punishment but not a capital one, and she would survive to return to her life, though her reputation was destroyed and her ability to practice her healing trade was ended. The judges had fulfilled their function. They had heard the evidence, applied the law and pronounced judgment according to the standards of their time. They had not been unusually cruel or arbitrary by the measures of early modern jurisprudence. They had acquitted the Samlesbury women when the evidence proved false, had required confessions or substantial testimony for conviction, had followed established legal procedures. That those procedures were stacked against defendants in witchcraft cases, that confessions extracted through isolation and fear were given the same weight as voluntary admissions, that spectral evidence and correlation were accepted as proof of causation. These were features of the system itself, not failures of individual judges. In the cells below the hall, the condemned waited. They had been tried and convicted, but the reality of what was coming had not yet fully penetrated. They would have a few more days of life, a few more opportunities to make peace with whatever gods or demons they believed in, a few more chances to reflect on the lives they had lived and the choices that had brought them to this ending. The castle around them hummed with activity as the assizes continued, as other cases were heard and decided, as justice ground forward with its inevitable momentum. And above the castle, workmen were constructing the gallows on the moor where the executions would take place, hammering together the framework from which 10 bodies would soon hang. Chapter 9. The Condemned. The hours between conviction and execution were measured differently from other time, stretched and compressed simultaneously, each moment both endless and fleeting. The 10 condemned prisoners were returned to their cells in the depths of Lancaster Castle, but they were no longer held with the general prison population. They were separated into cells designated for those awaiting execution, closer to the chapel where a priest would come to hear their final confessions, where they would be prepared for death, according to the rituals that the church prescribed even for those accused of trafficking with demons. Elizabeth Device sat on the stone floor of her cell, her back against the damp wall, her mind unable to fully grasp what had occurred in the courtroom above. She had been tried and convicted by the testimony of her own 9-year-old daughter, condemned by the child she had borne and raised in the desperate poverty of Malkin Tower. She tried to understand what had driven Janet to speak against her, tried to find some explanation beyond simple betrayal. Perhaps the child had been threatened, coerced by Roger Nowell or the other authorities. Perhaps she had been promised safety and comfort if she cooperated. Or perhaps Jenna had simply seen clearly what Elizabeth herself had failed to understand, that survival required cutting all ties to the condemned, that loyalty to family was a luxury that the powerless could not afford. The cell held 3 other women awaiting execution for different crimes, and they gave Elizabeth a wide berth, huddled in the opposite corner, making signs against evil when they thought she was not looking. Even among the condemned, witches were feared and shunned, marked as worse than ordinary criminals, tainted by their association with the devil. Elizabeth tried to pray, reaching for the words of the Ave Maria that her grandmother had taught her decades ago. But the Latin syllables came out garbled and incomplete, and she was not certain whether prayer was even permitted to someone who had been judged a witch. If she had truly given her soul to a demon as she had confessed, then perhaps God would no longer hear her, and she was damned regardless of whether she repented. Her son James was held in a cell nearby, close enough that she could sometimes hear his voice calling out, asking questions that no one answered, calling for his mother in the confusion that had become his constant state. He did not understand that he was going to die, could not grasp the concept of execution, knew only that he was in prison and wanted to go home. The guards ignored him when he called out, had long since stopped trying to explain what was happening. He was simple, clearly not fully responsible for his actions, but the law made no exception for those whose minds were weak. He had confessed to witchcraft, had threatened violence against magistrates, and those confessions were sufficient for conviction, regardless of his capacity to understand their meaning. Alison Device was held separately from her mother and brother, given no opportunity for final conversations with her family. She had been the first to confess, the first to implicate others, and that fact set her apart even among the condemned. She was 18 years old and had never known anything but poverty and hunger, and the marginal existence of the begging families. Now she would die without ever having experienced the ordinary life that other young women took for granted. Marriage, children of her own, a household to manage, the small satisfactions that made hard lives bearable. She thought about the pedlar John Law, about the moment on the road when he had refused her and then collapsed, about her own belief that she had caused his suffering. She could not now remember whether she had truly believed in her power in that moment, or whether she had simply seen an opportunity to claim it. to take credit for an affliction that might have been natural in its cause. Alice Nutter maintained her composure even in the condemned cell. She had been convicted despite her denials, had been found guilty of witchcraft based on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of confessed witches. She understood now that her initial assumptions about the legal system had been naive, that truth and justice were not synonymous, that a determined prosecution supported by confessions and frightened witnesses could overwhelm any defence that innocence might mount. She had no familiar spirit, had never cursed anyone, had never practised the arts that the others had claimed to possess. Her crime had been association, knowing the wrong people, visiting Malkin Tower at the hour. Wrong time, but the penalty for that crime was the same as for those who had confessed to decades of witchcraft: death by hanging. She spent her final days writing letters to her children, arranging what she could of her affairs through messages sent by their prison chaplain. Her property would be forfeit to the Crown after her execution, but she hoped that her family might retain something, that her children would not be left entirely destitute by her conviction. She wrote also to friends, protesting her innocence, asking them to remember her as she had been, rather than as the witch the court had judged her. Whether these letters were delivered, whether anyone outside the castle walls cared about the final words of a condemned witch, she had no way of knowing. Old Chattox and her daughter Anne Redfern shared a cell, given that small mercy by jailers who saw no reason to separate family members in their final days. The old woman had largely retreated into herself, speaking little, eating less, her body continuing its slow collapse that had begun months earlier. She was too old and too tired to feel much fear about the hanging that awaited her. Death had been her companion for decades, had taken her husband and most of her children, had walked beside her through a long life of poverty and struggle. That it was finally coming for her seemed almost natural, the completion of a pattern that had been established long ago. Anne Redfern was in her 40s, still strong enough to feel the full weight of her approaching death. She had maintained her innocence throughout the trial, had insisted that she knew nothing of witchcraft, had never harmed anyone through supernatural means. But her mother's confession had implicated her, and the jury had believed the confession over the denial. She would die for her mother's words, for association she could not escape, for the reputation that the Chattox family had built over generations. She tried not to be angry with the old woman huddled in the corner, tried to remember that old Chattox had been tortured by isolation and fear into confessing, but the anger came anyway, bitter and useless. Jane Bulcock and her son John were also kept together, the jailers seeing no reason to deny them that comfort. The old woman had accepted her fate with a resignation that might have been peace or simply exhaustion. She had lived longer than most people of her class and time, had survived famines and plagues and the deaths of most of her generation. If she was to die now, convicted of witchcraft, then perhaps that was simply the ending that fate had written for her. She spent her time praying, the prayers of her childhood mixed with charms and invocations that were older than Christianity, a hybrid faith that reflected her hybrid existence between the church and the older beliefs that had never been fully extinguished. John Bulcock was less accepting, paced the cell when his chains allowed, argued with the guards who brought food, insisted that they had committed no crime worthy of death. But his protests fell on ears that had heard such protests from hundreds of condemned prisoners, that had learned not to listen, not to engage with the suffering of those who were already dead in the eyes of the law. He tried to comfort his mother, to maintain some dignity in their final days, but the effort was difficult to sustain in conditions designed to strip away all dignity. Catherine Hewitt sat in her cell and replayed in her mind the decisions that had led her to this ending. She had attended the meeting at Malkin Tower, had eaten the stolen mutton, had listened to James Device threaten violence against Roger Nowell. She had not thought of it as a witches' Sabbath, had seen it simply as a gathering of frightened people trying to help their imprisoned relatives. But the gathering had been interpreted through the lens of witchcraft prosecution, had been transformed into evidence of conspiracy, and she had been swept up in that interpretation along with the others. She had confessed in the hope that confession would bring mercy, but there had been no mercy, only the cold application of law. The prison chaplain came to the cells each day, a priest assigned to prepare the condemned for death, to hear their confessions and offer what spiritual comfort the church could provide. He was a young man, relatively new to his position, troubled by the task of shepherding so many to execution at once. He heard their confessions, offered absolution according to the formulas prescribed, tried to determine whether their earlier confessions of witchcraft had been true or forced. Most of them now claimed that their confessions had been false, that they had said what the magistrate wanted to hear, that they were not truly witches. But whether these retractions were true or simply final attempts to avoid damnation, the chaplain could not determine. He administered communion to those who requested it, though some of the condemned were uncertain whether they were permitted to take the sacrament, whether their convictions for witchcraft had placed them beyond the reach of God's grace. The chaplain assured them that repentance was always possible, that God's mercy extended even to those who had trafficked with demons if they turned back to righteousness in their final hours. Whether he believed his own reassurances was unclear, but he offered them with apparent sincerity, and some of the condemned drew comfort from his words. The execution was scheduled for the 20th of August, the same day that the final verdicts had been delivered, but the practicalities of preparing the gallows and gathering the crowd meant that it was postponed until the following day. The condemned were given one more night of life, one more opportunity to make peace with their gods and their consciences. The castle fell quiet after dark, the sounds of the day's activities fading into the silence that always claimed the innocent. Building at night. In their cells the condemned tried to sleep, knowing it would be their last sleep, their last night of existence, however uncomfortable and fearful. Elizabeth Device did not sleep. She lay on the stone floor and thought about her life, about the choices that had been available to her, and the choices she had made. She had been born into poverty, had known nothing else, had raised her children in the same crushing want that had defined her own childhood. She had practiced the cunning arts her mother had taught her, had claimed powers she might or might not have actually possessed, had used fear as a tool for survival, and now she would die for those claims, hanged as a witch before a crowd that would see her death as entertainment and moral instruction. She thought about her children scattered and destroyed. Her mother was already dead, buried in unmarked ground. Alison would hang tomorrow. James would hang tomorrow. Only Janet would survive, the daughter who had betrayed her, who had testified with clear eyes and steady voice, who had understood what the adults had failed to grasp, that the machinery of law once set in motion would consume them all unless someone escaped its wheels. Elizabeth tried to hate Janet for that betrayal, but could not quite manage it. The child had done what she needed to survive, had made the only choice available to her. In a different way, Elizabeth had made similar choices throughout her life, had sacrificed principle for survival, had done what was necessary to get through another day. That the final choice had been made by her daughter rather than herself seemed almost fitting. Morning came eventually, the quality of light filtering through the high windows changing from black to grey to pale gold. The guards moved through the corridors, checking on the condemned, preparing them for transport to the gallows. The prisoners were given water to wash their faces and hands, given a final meal of bread and weak ale, then bound with ropes and chains for the journey. They would walk from the castle through the streets of Lancaster to the moor where the executions would take place. A final public procession that served as both spectacle and warning to the watching crowds. Chapter 10. The Shadow That Remains. The morning of the 21st of August broke clear and bright over Lancaster, the kind of day that seemed too beautiful for death, when the sky stretched blue and endless, and the summer light made every stone of the castle glow warm. The crowds had been gathering since before dawn, people coming from throughout Lancashire and beyond, some walking for days to witness the execution of the Pendle witches. The moor where the gallows stood was perhaps half a mile from the castle, elevated ground that allowed for good visibility, where hundreds could gather to watch justice being dispensed. The gallows structure was simple and functional, built from heavy timber, with a crossbeam high enough to allow the condemned to drop the distance necessary to break their necks if the execution was properly managed. 10 nooses hung from the beam, spaced along its length, rope that had been carefully prepared and tested to ensure it would hold the weight of the bodies. A ladder leaned against the gallows structure, allowing the condemned to climb up to their deaths. The executioner and his assistants waited nearby, checking the ropes, preparing for the work ahead. The condemned were brought from the castle in a procession that wound through the narrow streets of Lancaster, guards surrounding them, the sheriff and his deputies leading the way, the prison chaplain walking alongside offering final prayers and exhortations. The prisoners were bound but not hooded, their faces visible to the crowds that lined the streets, people pressing forward to see the witches, to stare at those who had been judged servants of Satan. Some in the crowd jeered and threw garbage, others watched in silence, perhaps moved by the sight of the condemned shuffling toward their deaths, perhaps simply reserving their voices for the moment of execution itself. Elizabeth Device walked in the procession, with her eyes downcast, unable to meet the stares of the watching crowd. Her son James walked ahead of her, still confused, calling out questions that no one answered. Behind her came Alice Nutter, walking with her head up despite everything, maintaining dignity even in these final moments. Old Chattox was barely able to walk. Supported by guards on either side, her ancient body carried more than led toward the gallows. The others followed in order, a line of the condemned making their way toward the moor, toward the waiting ropes, toward the ending that the law had prescribed. The crowd on the moor was enormous, perhaps 1,000 people or more, come to witness the largest mass execution for witchcraft that England had seen. They packed the available space, jostling for better views, lifting children onto shoulders so they could see, talking excitedly about what was to come. For most of them, this was entertainment as much as moral instruction, a break from the routine of ordinary life, a spectacle they would remember and discuss for years. Some had brought food and drink, planning to make a day of it. Others sold broadsides describing the crimes of the witches and the details of their trials, crude printed sheets that would be carried home and read aloud to families who had not attended. The condemned reached the gallows and were arranged beneath it, positioned beneath their respective nooses. The executioner and his men moved efficiently, placing each noose around each neck, adjusting the knots to the proper position, checking the ropes. The prison chaplain read from the Book of Common Prayer, offering final words of comfort and warning, reminding the condemned to repent their sins and trust in God's mercy, reminding the watching crowd that this was justice being dispensed, that these deaths served to protect the community from those who would harm it through supernatural means. The condemned were given the opportunity to make final statements. Most declined or could not speak, their voices choked with fear, their minds overwhelmed by the reality of what was happening. Elizabeth Device managed a few words, protesting her innocence, saying she had confessed only because she was frightened, asking forgiveness from those she had harmed and from God who would judge her soul. James Device said nothing coherent, continued calling for his mother even though she stood beside him. Alazon Device spoke clearly, admitted her guilt, said she deserved her punishment, asked those watching to pray for her soul. Alice Nutter maintained her innocence to the end, said she was wrongly convicted, that she had never practiced witchcraft, that she died an innocent woman. Her words were met with scepticism from the crowd, who believed that a guilty verdict from the assizes was proof of guilt, that the judges would not have condemned an innocent person. Some shouted at her to confess, to admit her crimes, but she refused, and her refusal was interpreted as the final proof of her wickedness, her determination to die in sin rather than acknowledge the truth. The executioner received his signal from the sheriff and the work began. The ladder was pulled away and the first condemned dropped, the rope snapping taut, the body jerking and then going still as the neck broke cleanly. The crowd gasped and then cheered. One by one the condemned were dropped, each death marked by the snap of rope and the collective sound of the watching crowd. Some died quickly, their necks breaking in the fall. Others were less fortunate, strangling slowly, their bodies thrashing at the end of the rope, taking long minutes to die while the crowd watched, and the executioner's assistants pulled on their legs to hasten the end. Elizabeth Device died slowly, the rope not positioned quite right, her body convulsing as she strangled. Her son James died beside her, his simple face frozen in an expression of confusion that death did not erase. Alison died quickly, a small mercy in her final moments. Alice Nutter died with her eyes open, her face showing neither fear nor repentance, holding to her dignity until consciousness left her. Old Chattox's ancient body offered little resistance to the rope, and she died almost immediately, perhaps already half dead before the drop. Her daughter Anne Redfern hung beside her, their bodies swaying in the slight breeze that came across the moor. The Bulcocks died together, mother and son, their deaths unmarked by any particular drama or protest. Catherine Hewitt died in silence, having said nothing, throughout the final procession and execution. Isabel Roby, the last to be dropped, died as the crowd was already beginning to disperse, some having seen enough, others staying to watch the bodies displayed, to ensure that the witches were truly dead and would not somehow return. The bodies were left hanging for several hours, displayed as warning and example. The crowd gradually dispersed, returning to Lancaster or to their homes in the surrounding country, carrying with them the memory of what they had witnessed. Some felt satisfied that justice had been done, that dangerous witches had been removed from society. Others felt uneasy, troubled by what they had seen, by the brutality of the executions, and by doubts about whether all the condemned had truly been guilty. But most simply returned to their lives, to the business of survival that occupied the attention of ordinary people, and the Pendle witches became a story to be told, a cautionary tale about the dangers of witchcraft and the certainty of punishment. The bodies were eventually cut down and buried in unmarked graves, probably somewhere on the moor or in unconsecrated ground near the castle. There would be no monuments, no markers, nothing to indicate where the condemned lay. They had been judged witches, and witches did not deserve the dignity of Christian burial in hallowed ground. Their graves would be forgotten within a generation, their bones mixing with the earth, all physical trace of their existence erased. Roger Nowell returned to Red Hall satisfied with the outcome of the trials. He had successfully prosecuted the largest group of witches ever tried in England, had obtained convictions in all but one of the cases, had demonstrated his competence and loyalty to the crown. His career as a magistrate was secure, his reputation enhanced. The king's government sent him letters of commendation, noting his thorough investigation and successful prosecution. He would continue to serve as magistrate for years afterward, hearing cases of theft and assault and disorder, maintaining the king's peace in Lancashire. The Pendle witch trials would be the most significant achievement of his career, the accomplishment for which he would be remembered. Thomas Potts, the clerk of the court, was commissioned to write an account of the trials, to document the evidence and verdicts for publication. His book, titled The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster, was published in 1613, became a bestseller, and ensured that the story of the Pendle witches would be preserved and disseminated throughout England. Potts presented the trials as a triumph of justice, proof that vigilant authorities could identify and punish those who conspired with demons. His account included the depositions and confessions, the testimony of witnesses, the verdicts and sentences, all organised to demonstrate the guilt of the accused and the righteousness of their punishment. Janet Device, the 9-year-old who had testified against her family, disappeared from the historical record after the trials. She was presumably raised by the family who had taken custody of her, though whether she ever understood the full implications of her testimony, whether she felt guilt or simply relief at her survival, cannot be known. Some accounts suggest she later became destitute, that her reputation as the girl who had betrayed her family made her an outcast, that she lived a hard life and died young. Other accounts are silent, offering no information about what became of her. She had made the choice that ensured her survival, had sacrificed her family to save herself, and history offers no clear judgment about whether that choice was morally defensible or simply the desperate act of a child who had no other options. The village around Pendle Hill slowly returned to normal after the executions. Malkin Tower collapsed completely, the stones scattered by the weather and scavengers, the site eventually lost to memory. The families who had lived there were gone, executed or scattered, and no one took their place. The forest reclaimed the paths they had walked, the clearings where they had gathered herbs, the small spaces they had carved from the wilderness through generations of desperate survival. Within a few years, it was as if they had never existed. But the memory of the trials persisted. Pendle Hill acquired a reputation as a place of witchcraft. A landscape marked by the events of 1612, travellers avoided it when possible, considered it cursed or haunted. Stories were told of strange lights seen on the hill at night, of voices heard in the forest, of cattle that died mysteriously in the fields below. Whether these stories reflected genuine supernatural phenomena or simply the human tendency to find significance in random events, they ensured that the hill would be associated with witchcraft for generations. The legal precedent established by the Pendle trials was significant. The successful prosecution of such a large group based primarily on confessions and the testimony of family members provided a model for future witchcraft trials in England. The methods Roger Nowell had used, isolating suspects, extracting confessions through patience and psychological pressure rather than torture, using the testimony of children and accomplices, would be employed by other magistrates facing similar accusations. The trials demonstrated that witchcraft prosecutions could be managed efficiently within the existing legal system without requiring special courts or procedures. But the Pendle trials also represented something of a high watermark for witchcraft prosecution in England. While individual cases continued to be tried for decades afterward, never again would such a large group be prosecuted simultaneously. The scepticism that had led to the acquittal of the Samlesbury witches would grow stronger over time, as educated opinion increasingly questioned the reality of witchcraft and the reliability of the evidence used to convict accused witches. By the end of the 17th century, witchcraft prosecutions in England had largely ceased. The laws against witchcraft were repealed, and the era of witch trials came to an end. Pendle Hill stands today as it stood in 1612, a dark mass rising from the Lancashire landscape, its summit often shrouded in mist. The villages at its base have changed, grown into small towns with modern amenities, connected to the wider world by roads and telecommunications that would have seemed like witchcraft themselves to the people of the 17th century. But the hill remains, and with it remains the memory of what happened in its shadow 400 years ago. The story of the Pendle witches has been told and retold in histories and novels, in plays and films, in tourist literature that markets the trials as local colour, as heritage to be consumed by visitors seeking connection to a darker past. The graves of the condemned are lost, but memorials have been erected, walking trails established, annual commemorations held. The witches have been transformed from actual human beings who suffered and died into symbols, into representatives of an era when belief in magic was commonplace, and the boundary between the natural and supernatural was porous and uncertain. Whether any of the Pendle witches actually possessed supernatural powers, whether their confessions reflected genuine belief in their own abilities or simply strategic responses to coercive interrogation, whether they deserved the punishment they received or were victims of hysteria and injustice, these questions remain contested. The historical record provides the bare facts of accusation, trial and execution, but cannot penetrate to the internal lives of the accused, cannot determine with certainty what they believed about themselves and their abilities. What is certain is that they were poor, that they lived on the margins of society, that they survived through means that made their neighbours fearful and resentful, and that when the machinery of prosecution was turned against them, they had no resources to resist it. They were ground up by legal processes they did not understand, condemned by their own words and the testimony of their families, killed in a public spectacle that served simultaneously as entertainment and warning. Their deaths changed nothing fundamental about the society that had produced them, did not address the poverty and desperation that had made their particular form of survival necessary in the first place. The candles burned low in Lancaster Castle on the night after the executions, The cells that had held the condemned were cleaned out, the straw removed and burned, the stones washed down, preparing for the next batch of prisoners who would occupy those spaces. The assizes concluded, the judges departed for the next town on their circuit, and Lancaster returned to its ordinary business. The moor where the gallows stood was quiet, the structure left in place for future use, the ground beneath marked by the shadows of the bodies that had hung there. And on Pendle Hill the forest whispered in the wind as it always had, the trees moving with rhythms that predated human habitation, that would continue long after the last memory of the trials had faded. The hill kept its secrets, offered no judgment about what had transpired, simply existed as it had existed for millennia, indifferent to the small dramas of human justice and cruelty that had played out in its shadow. History turned its page, moved forward to new crises and conflicts, and the Pendle witches receded into the past. 10 lives ended on a bright August morning. 10 stories concluded in darkness and fear. 10 graves lost to time and weather and the forest's patient reclamation of all things.